Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing story. What if Deku was a necromancer? This amazing story was written by Magnus9284. Please support them. Don't forget to like, sub, and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. A sinister success. Tenya Ida found himself, in a word, concerned. His partner, while not his first choice, had proven himself to be quite strong and intelligent, but that wasn't the source of his apprehension. Bakugo pacing back and forth before the entrance to their test building like a caged animal, palms already popping with small explosions, and a snarl twisting his face did. The tall, bespectacled teen didn't know how to calm the blonde down either. He couldn't see any reason for such obvious hostility. It was clear to him, however, that Bakugo had no qualms about not holding back against their opponents, which was also alarming. The two green-themed teens may have proven themselves worthy of their places in the hero course without a doubt, but they couldn't possibly pose too much of a threat against them with the quirks and comeback capabilities they held. "Can you please calm down?" Ida asked, again, for the fifth time. Even equipped in his hero costume as he was, which most agreed gave him a futuristic knight appearance, his displeasure at his partner's behavior was unmistakable. Without missing a beat, or looking away from what he was glaring at, Bakugo shoved a gloved hand in Ida's direction, middle finger raised skyward. "Shut the fuck up, stupid four eyes," the blonde shouted, still glaring at the test building. The glower only paused when the explosive teen took a moment to check the numerous belts and clippings of his hero costume. Special attention was paid to the two grenade-shaped arm guards he wore. Ida sighed, once again deciding to ignore the offensive and vulgar gestures and language of his partner. This time, he merely pinched the bridge of his nose under his helmet in exasperation. "What has you so restless?" Ida asked now, hoping that a chance to unload his frustrations would allow the pacing blonde to cool off slightly. "Are you troubled by our opponents? Their quirks? Do you think?" A sudden thought stopped Ida cold, one he hadn't considered before. While it was true that most mutant-type quirk users faced the wrath of society's quirk hierarchy to one degree or another, his family was a rare and special case. Since their mutation only caused minute changes to their physicality, namely wherever their particular variety of engines exhaust pipes appeared, it was easily hidden. Out of sight, out of mind as it were. As his family had gained prominence over the years, less and less attention was brought to their hereditary quirk's nature and more was placed on its power. Today, he couldn't think of a single person who'd ever looked at an Ida and disparaged them based on quirk alone. But what if Bakugo was being so negatively affected by a more obvious mutation? Do you find Azui-san dangerous?" Ida asked hesitantly, hoping his partner wasn't about to be revealed as a quirkist. The question at least got a long-awaited answer from the angry blonde. "Ugly frog face. Dangerous." Bakugo threw back, turning to face the extra that had the honor of being his partner. "Don't make me laugh. That malformed thing doesn't even register on my radar. I bet money a small explosion to the face would be all it would take to put it down." Ida reared back from the blonde's deranged, psychopathic words, more worried now than ever. This was worse than just a quirkist mindset. "What is wrong with? How can you even?" Ida couldn't even fully form his emphatic reprimand. His temper had caught so quickly. Before the speedster could attempt to collect himself, a sharp buzzing of an alarm signaled the start of the exercise. Bureau, UA faculty office. For the third day in a row, Aizawa sat at his second desk and gave the files of two of his students a once-over. It had turned out his hunch had been right. Katsuki Bakugo and Izuka Midoriya had been classmates since kindergarten all the way through middle school. What had caused the normally unflappable man to need 2 nights of breathers in between research and this discovery was the accompanying lack of data regarding any interaction between the two. It was abnormal, to say the least. Bakugo's record was full of surprisingly high grades, not at all the record of the brainless delinquent his temper portrayed him as. And he'd not been able to find a single mark against the kid, which was more than a little suspicious given the blonde's attitude. There was no way the bomber hadn't gotten into, at the very least, a few fights over the years. Midoriya, on the other hand, didn't seem to have gone a handful of days without suffering beatings. Beatings, the gruff teacher had noted. Administrators in all 3 schools, especially the middle school, had downplayed to the point that a culprit had never even been investigated. The infuriating reason for such oversight? A single line, repeated over and over again. No evidence of lasting harm. that both teens had walked away from governmentally mandated scholastic psych evaluations with spotless all clears was such a load of bullshit, Aizawa muttered to the otherwise empty room. Taking a second to shake away his rising frustrations at the obvious manipulations of glory-seeking institutions, the brusque teacher decided to take a chance and see how severe the situation might actually be. Using UA's special search engine designed by some of I-Island's finest, the Pro Hero input, Aldera Junior High. Immediately, multiple flags were raised. It looked like this wasn't the first time the middle school had looked the other way for students they felt showed promise. Aizawa almost did a double take, almost, when he read that one such rising star had been expelled from Shiketsu a couple of years back for the attempted rape of a classmate. That's it. I'm demanding this school be blacklisted from our acceptance roll, Aizawa grumbled, standing. Seeing the time on the office's clock, he stopped before hastily grabbing his phone. I need to warn All Might. We need to separate those two before it's too late. Aizawa power walked out of the faculty room and down the hall while the phone rang, hoping that his muscular idiot of a coworker hadn't done something stupid like pitted the blonde and Verdinette against each other. Or, God forbid, he could have put them on the same team. It's true he didn't have the whole picture yet. Some might even label his next actions as paranoid. But as he picked up his pace, the pro hero knew in his gut he had enough evidence to warrant his behavior. There was little doubt in his mind that Bakugo had been the one to bully Midoriya. Administrators had tampered with or outright neglected to file reports, and it was probably all in the hopes of gaining renown by having the explosive blonde attend UA. Why Midoriya was the victim was still a mystery, as was why the green-haired teen had never fought back. But Aizawa swore on his melatonin he'd find out. Ground Beta, Test Building. The hero team of Bakugo and Ida reached the last unsearched room of the first floor in a state of increasing annoyance. There had not been a single clue of their opponent's whereabouts to be found yet, and while one knew that gathering information before striking was the smart thing to do, the other couldn't care less about anything else other than finding his target and unleashing hell. Making their way to the stairs in hopes of better luck on the next floor, Bakugo decided he'd had enough. Romero, where the fuck are you? The blonde's scream reverberated through the empty building so strongly that Ida cringed away not only from the lack of subtlety, but also the sudden ringing in his ears. The bespectacled teen was about to chastise his degenerate of a partner, again, for his choice of language when the unthinkable occurred. I'm right here, Kakin, came Izuku's voice from the top of the stairs. Snapping their heads up, the hero team saw the regenerators standing on the landing, just looking down at them. Ida would swear from that day forward that the temperature dropped 20 degrees Celsius after that strange name was thrown out. He would never believe that it was once a term of endearment and not an insult of some kind. Fucking Romero, what did I say about calling me that? Bakugo growled in a dangerously low voice, his right hand open and dripping with sweat from running all over the first floor. Instead of answering, the green-haired teen simply laughed before darting upstairs. Unprepared for such an action, it took a second for the blonde to process what had just happened. And when he did, "Come back here so I can kill you." Bakugo screamed bloody murder as he ran up the stairs, chasing his nemesis as if nothing else mattered. Ida moved to follow, but as soon as he reached the second floor himself, he noticed something peculiar. Shoe prints, marked with yellow paint, trekked from down one of the hallways to up the stairs where Midoriya had gone. A trail, Ida muttered, peering down the paint-covered hall. Originating from this floor? It couldn't be as simple as it appeared, could it? Although, logically speaking, it would be in the villain team's best interest. I see, Ida said to himself, nodding once. Midoriya's acting as a decoy. It's too bad he didn't notice the paint. Decision made. Bakugo could handle himself after all. The bespectacled teen followed the trail of paint until he reached the central hallway at the end of the corridor. On the floor, with shoe prints splattering out of it, spread an innocent puddle of yellow paint in front of a door at the other end of the hall. It looked as if Midoriya had been in a rush and stepped into it accidentally. So that was your plan? Guide us upstairs while hiding the bomb close to the entrance where we'd never think to look. Ida thought out loud. I suppose they didn't have too much time to make anything more elaborate. Knowing he had to be close to his goal, the bespectacled teen continued down the main hall, keeping an eye out for the frog girl. While she was most likely waiting on the other side of the door, there was always the chance of an ambush. He'd need to be careful regardless. Her legs were no doubt incredibly powerful, and the probability of her having enhanced reflexes meant that if he didn't capitalize on his entrance, she'd have no trouble both evading him and keeping the bomb secure. Ida really didn't want to chance such a thing. If he took too much time capturing the bomb, and Azui if it came to it, then he wouldn't be able to cut the fight between Bakugo and Midoriya short before the blonde took his violence too far. As he walked and thought, the bespectacled teen felt his foot step in something. Before he could react, a pallet of paint cans fell on him. Gah! Ida screamed, his visor becoming completely obscured. Throwing his arms out, the hero in training wasn't sure if he was trying to keep his balance or fend off any potential attackers. When wiping at the paint failed to work, Ida realized he would have to take the whole helmet off if he wanted to regain his bearings. In his mind, the bespectacled teen cursed his lack of attention to his environment as he did so. Of course there'd be at least one trap. Ida spat in anger, taking a moment to examine his ruined piece of armor. It looked ridiculous, covered in so many brilliant colors. Calling it garish was literally an understatement. What was worse, the rest of his costume was the same. And the cherry on top, she knows I'm here. Ida realized, sensibly concluding that the trap was more of an alarm than an attempt at waylaying him. Accepting that the element of surprise was now completely gone, Ida continued his trek without ceremony or care. He hoped that Azui wouldn't laugh at his sorry state when he confronted her, appearing more an unsightly sidekick bumbling out of a mishap than a valiant hero coming to the rescue. Reaching the door with the puddle, the bespectacled teen opened it, expecting the worst. Instead, he was greeted with the sight of Azui watching him curiously while crouched down in front of the fake bomb. It was obvious to him from the frog girl's intense stare that she was ready to make her stand at any moment. Ida gulped, truly believing if he took his eyes off his opponent, it would prove fatal. I didn't expect our warning system to fall on you, Karo, he said, a finger raised to her mouth in thought. Did it hurt? The words maybe appeared charitable, but never once did Azui lose track of any move Ida made. The bespectacled teen actually felt like it was more an attempt to distract him with friendly banter than anything, something his brother had warned him about. It took me by surprise, yes, Ida answered, making a circuit around the room under Azui's watchful eye. But it won't affect my combat capabilities. Completing his canvassing, Ida took notice of all of the boxes and tools that had been scattered around. No matter how he tried to position himself, he couldn't find a path that he could use to maximize his acceleration. Why didn't you follow your partner? Azui asked. He might already be down and captured without your help, Karo. Considering the comment to be a classic attempt at lowering morale, Ida merely shook his head in response. He ignored the twinge of doubt that tried to rise up at the frog girl's words. Unlikely, Ida countered. Bakugo is very much a combat-oriented individual. Midoriya is more of a field support type. It's a match in our favor. You should be more worried about yourself, Azui-san. Ida counted the few steps he had before he could achieve victory. First, he'd position himself in the best spot possible to make a proper line, one with the least amount of junk in the way. Then, he'd immediately strike with his best move. It'd be too quick for the frog girl to react in time to stop him. It felt like cheating, but the bespectacled teen wasn't about to lose his first hero exercise. She watched in morbid fascination as everything, to the tiniest detail, unfolded just as Izuku had predicted. From Ida falling into the booby trap, to the way he kept his eyes on her the whole time while positioning himself, it was all happening. As her temporary adversary took his final steps into position, the frog girl couldn't help but remember Izuku's plan. Ida's a good guy, that much is obvious, so it stands to reason he'll attempt to retrieve the weapon instead of fighting to avoid hurting you, Izuku had said. That's why we're only going to give him one path to achieve that goal. And once he steps into that perfect position to strike, he'll be finished. She'd been worried the bespectacled teen would notice the real trap they'd be setting for him, but Izuku had calmed that fear easily enough. Don't worry, he'd said. He'll never see the trap. Ida suffers from tunnel vision, so he'll only see you and his target. Izuku's prediction had been terrifyingly accurate. Ida hadn't even thought to ask where Tei was. And hell, she wasn't even hiding. Even now, as the bespectacled teen took his last step for a perfect line drive charge position, he never noticed the zombie girl standing behind him. It was all the noise Ida could make as he felt his throat being crushed, his legs spasming as he tried to gain enough traction to relieve the pressure on his windpipe. Ever so stealthily, Tay had managed to come up behind the bespectacled teen and use Izuku's tie as a garrote wire, holding her prey just high enough that the force of his own weight would slowly suffocate him. Then, she raised him higher. "You should probably stop struggling, Ida-san, Karo," Thieu advised to the hanging teen as she carefully approached. From behind her back, the frog girl pulled out her roll of capture tape. Ida, quickly becoming desperate for air, had resorted to thrashing kicks and elbowing the zombie girl for all he was worth. Unfortunately for him, the attacks had no effect whatsoever. Even as he heard his strikes breaking her ribs, Tay refused to loosen her hold in the slightest. Before long, black spots began to flitter across the bespectacled teen's vision and his strength started to fail. Now despairing, Ida realized his only hope was for Tsu to capture him as quickly as possible and hoped that would be enough for the zombie girl to release him. The monitoring room. All Might and the rest of 1A observed through the camera feeds as everything they'd seen transpire for the last 10 minutes came to a head. They'd watched as Izuku, Thieu, and Tay had moved the boxes and tools from where they'd rested against the back wall to haphazardly around the room. They'd watched as Izuku had jury-rigged a booby trap from paint cans and then purposefully stepped through a puddle of the stuff. Now everything made sense, from the selection of the floor to how Izuku had greeted the hero team. That was evil. Mineta was the first to voice his opinion. Judging by the looks on his classmates' faces, it wasn't as widely shared as he believed it should be. Momo shook her head, stepping forward from the back to see the screens better. "No, it was creative," the mature girl corrected. "Neither Midoriya nor Azui have the appropriate quirks to face a hero team with that kind of power head-on. Resorting to a tactical approach was the right response. If anything, Bakugo and Ida are at fault for believing their opponents would tackle their roles like grunts." The academic recommendation student of 1A hoped her classmates realized the gravity of what they'd just witnessed. Here was proof that being tactical was just as important as being powerful. Still, don't you think they embraced the role of villains a little too much? Masahiro Ojiro, a blond boy with a muscular tail, said while scratching his chin. The teen thanked his ancestors he didn't have to fight such characters. He doubted his martial arts would be too effective against a zombie. It was especially worrisome because this one wasn't the slow monster depicted in some media. "Know thy enemy and know thyself. Then you shall not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles," Tokoyami quoted, trying to defend his friend. By perceiving the inner machinations of a villain, a hero's labor is made easier. We should all endeavor to learn by this example. Jiro, more focused on the monitors than the conversation behind her, leaned closer to the screen. The punk rock girl frowned at what she was seeing. "So why did Midoriya stop there?" Jiro asked, pointing at the digital display in sarcastic confusion. The screen in question showed the main hall of the test building's 5th floor. Izuku was hidden behind one of the support pillars while Bakugo remained in a connecting hallway, about to enter the chamber. Noticing that another battle was most likely about to occur, everyone's focus turned back to the monitors. All Might readied himself to call a stop to the exercise if either student allowed things to get out of control. Main hall of the 5th floor. Bakugo kicked the door before him open, the full force of his rage nearly ripping it from its hinges, and stepped into the chamber with all the manner of a beast drunk on bloodlust. He was going to make that damnable nerd pay, for never knowing his place, for daring to use that fucking cutesy nickname, for destroying his dream of being the only one from Aldera to make it to UA, and for beating his scores on the apprehension test with cheap tricks instead of physical talent. Today was the day that Goody Two-Shoes felt the full brunt of being his prey. "You done running?" Bakugo shouted, raising his hands in preparation. He'd end this farce of a match in one blow. "Fucking Romero." The explosive blonde looked at the floor, cursing when he saw it was covered in yellow shoe prints going in every direction. The damn nerd was still playing with him. Running? From what? Izuku's questioning voice resonated throughout the hall, making it even harder to pinpoint his location. "No, I've just been waiting for you to get here. But speaking of running, you on the other hand seem a bit winded. Did only a couple of stairs tire you out?" Kaken, barely able to see through the red filling his vision, Bakugo twisted around, searching for a hint of the Verdinette's location. His boiling blood only caused him to breathe harder, turn faster as no clue emerged. "Shut the fuck up with that name." The blonde thundered, small explosions popping like firecrackers in his hands. "So you're hiding now? You fucking coward." Bakugo, seeing his search tactic was fruitless, attempted to slow his breathing, listening carefully for even a whisper of movement. If that abomination the nerd kept as a pet was in here, then there's no way it'd be able to stay quiet for long. For a few seconds, there was no answer, but then a rustling sound so faint most would miss it came from his right. It was all the information the blonde needed. "Doesn't matter," Bakugo boasted, subtly preparing to strike. "Now that you're trapped in here with me, your only option is to take your punishment like the obedient little shit you're supposed to be. And I promise it won't be quick." The blonde's voice became ever more sadistic as he delivered his threat. He could feel his adrenaline searing its way through him at the prospect of finally being able to go all out on someone who deserved it. This would be a lesson for all the other extras of what happened when you didn't stay out of his way. "That's where you're wrong." Kakin, Izuku's rebuff sounded from right behind the pillar that Bakugo had been stalking. Deciding to take his chance, the blonde leapt forward to make his first shot a surprise attack. "Die!" Bakugo roared, firing off a large explosion. Waving the resulting smoke away hurriedly, it was revealed. He'd hit only empty air. "You're the one trapped in here with me," Izuku finished, his voice coming from just behind Bakugo. Out of sheer instinct, the blonde rolled forward, a whooshing sound whipping by his head. The sound of glass shattering followed immediately afterwards. Bakugo realized if he hadn't reacted in time, a bottle would have just smashed his head. And still, there was no sign of the nerd, only the remains of the broken bottle on the floor. "Fucking bastard," Bakugo muttered loudly. He kept his eyes jumping from pillar to pillar. The little shit had to be behind one of them. A soft chuckle echoed around the hall, but there was little humor in it. "Already on edge?" Izuku's disembodied voice called out. "Who's the coward now?" The taunt hit a nerve, Bakugo growling in anger, and, not that he'd ever admit it, even to himself, slight despair. He was too leery of his prey's actions to blindly charge in again, however. Even one as great as he would succumb to a well-placed strike to the back of the head. "Are you growling?" Izuku asked, still phantasmal. "Am I dealing with a dog now?" While mocking his childhood tormentor, Izuku was busy readying his plan B, since plan A had failed. He was kind of disconcerted how easy it was to make impromptu knuckle dusters from discarded wire though. The metal actually made the weapon quite the danger, as it would not only increase the solidity of his punches, but also cut due to the mismatched, overlapping filaments. Now he just had to be ready to withstand a beating until the timer sounded. "Just fucking die," Bakugo screamed, shooting an even larger explosion at the pillar in front of him. He didn't know if the nerd was behind it, but if he kept turning the supports to dust then he'd hit him eventually. Prepared for just such a strategy from his aggressor, Izuku had leapt from his cover the moment before the explosion had started. He avoided the destruction of the pillar by millimeters. Bakugo caught movement from the corner of his eye and watched in disbelief as his prey charged at him while the smoke and ash from his attack still billowed through the air. He didn't have enough to redirect his arm, let alone recharge it with enough sweat to be worth a damn. That left only one option. Switching arms, the blonde discharged all the sweat on his offhand, igniting a weak explosion with poor aim. Izuku easily dodged the sloppy assault, although he knew Bakugo probably expected that. After all, this wouldn't be the first time he'd sidestepped one of the blonde's explosions. "Motherfucker!" Bakugo raged, switching arms again to discharge a small explosion toward the approaching Verdinette's abdomen with his already tired hand. Unlike before, Izuku didn't avoid this blast. This time, the green-haired teen pushed through the searing pain and threw a right hook with as much power as he could muster into Bakugo's temple. The strike stunned the blonde, sending him to the ground slightly disoriented. Unbeknownst to the two combatants, in the monitoring room, every one of their classmates had winced upon witnessing that last brutal exchange. Most worried about Izuku's well-being. That explosion had been at point-blank range. That worry then became horror as they watched the green-haired teen stumble out of the fading smoke, clothes destroyed, with a large chunk of his abdomen turned to charred flesh. All Might even moved to call off the exercise before staring in stricken fascination as the blackened flesh quickly reverted to its original healthy state. The only remaining evidence an attack had even landed was the boy's torn and burned clothes. "You're going to need to try a lot harder if you want to take me down, you know?" Izuku said as he walked toward his downed opponent, an opponent that was struggling to stand. The green-haired teen was glad his pain tolerance was so high nowadays. That explosion to the gut had hurt a lot, but he'd been prepared for it from the beginning. Knowing each injury he took here was an injury his newest friend wouldn't have to suffer made it easier to take as well. "Go to hell." Bakugo slurred, his head still ringing. Taking a gamble, the blonde rolled and leapt toward the nerd that thought he was something special, aiming to surprise the little shit with his own well-practiced right swing. Izuku quickly stepped into the surprise attack, caught the offending arm, and, applying a textbook judo throw, sent Bakugo back to the floor with force. While completing the counter, the green-haired teen smoothly added a well-placed punch to the blonde's face, breaking his nose. Bakugo rolled to the side in an attempt to avoid further injury, his face in agony and his brain unable to properly focus. The worst injury, however, was that his nemesis stood there fresh as lettuce and showed not a single sign of being hurt. Watching with questioning eyes as the explosive blonde staggered while trying to stand, Izuku wondered why so little was affecting someone as violent as Bakugo so much. The only thing different from any other day was that he wasn't holding back. The two punches the green-haired teen had thrown, while enhanced by his improvised knuckle dusters, were also thrown with absolute disregard for self-preservation. They felt normal to him, but they carried so much more force than a normal punch would have, which probably explained the pain in his fingers and wrists that was fading away now. Izuku realized something else in that moment. He could pull off Plan C. He could win this fight. "Do yourself a favor and give up," Izuku taunted his discombobulated opponent. "You just can't win." If there was one thing the green-haired teen knew how to do, it was push Katsuki Bakugo's buttons. And if he really wanted to fully defeat the blonde in this fight, he'd need to completely break him. Otherwise, the explosive teen wouldn't learn anything. Bakugo sneered at the little shit that spoke down to him like an enraged, feral animal. The freak stood there, all tall and proud of himself, with an air of superiority hanging off him. It was unacceptable. Pushing with every bit of his fury, the blonde was able to force himself to stand. Not waiting a second, he set off an explosion, creating a smokescreen to buy a few seconds more time. The explosive teen had hoped his damn arm bracers would have been fully charged by now, but he wasn't about to wait any longer. He was going to defeat the pebble that foolishly thought itself a mountain and show it that it should have stayed in its place by the side of the road. "I'm going to kill you," Bakugo shouted, bringing his hands together. He aimed, fully resolved for the resulting blast to incinerate the nerd to the bone. Much to the blonde's surprise, Izuku had already leapt forward. Throwing a straight, the green-haired teen landed a punch to the face just as his opponent's explosion went off in his own. Both combatants fell. Once again, unbeknownst to the two battling teens, the remaining entirety of 1A was watching from the monitoring room, gasps and screams of horror filling the air at the scene. More than one would beg All Might to stop the fight, a plea the pro-hero would have answered if not for the one detail he was quick to point out. Turning his students' attention back to the screen, the concerned classmates bore witness as Izuku rose up, his face nothing but nightmarishly blackened flesh and eyes that ran like egg yolks. Then, before their very eyes, the green-haired teen's face began to return to normal, new skin and eyes growing so fast the changes were perceptible. By the time their classmate finished standing back up, he was completely unblemished. "You're getting tired," Izuku stated, walking towards a struggling Bakugo. "You're slower, and your explosions are getting weaker. You're done for. In fact, you lost this fight the moment you left your partner alone." Bakugo was seeing double at this point, and dizzy was an extreme understatement to how he was feeling. The blonde hated to admit it, but the freak's punches hit like a truck. "Fucking Romero, you're beneath me," Bakugo wheezed, able to finally get his feet under him and stand up. Any of the 17 observers in the monitoring room would have said the blonde looked ready to drop with one more well-placed punch. But like a cornered animal, this was his last stand, and he was going to put everything he had into it. Izuku advanced slowly with fists up, like a boxer. Once within arm's reach of the blonde, Bakugo threw a hand out for a close-range explosion. Expecting such reliance on his quirk, the green-haired teen swung his body downward and to the side, avoiding his opponent's attack completely. Seeing the little shit stand tall and undamaged, and ready to throw a punch at him, Bakugo reacted on sheer instinct again and threw out his other hand. He couldn't muster too much sweat, so the resulting explosion was small, but it turned out it wouldn't have mattered anyway. The freak repeated his dodge maneuver, this time to the blonde's opposite side. In that instant, the explosive teen felt something he hadn't truly experienced in a long time. Fear. Watching as Bakugo's eyes broadcasted him entering panic mode, Izuku preformed his evasion tactic again and again, whether there was an explosion or not. Each step gained the green-haired teen a bit of momentum, and the instant he knew the blonde couldn't track him anymore, he launched his punch. Bakugo sensed an incoming attack and allowed his instincts to guide his arms to cover his already injured head. Unfortunately for him, this worked against him, as the target had been his liver. Searing pain the likes of which he'd never experienced before shot through the blonde, forcing his arms down in a reflexive move to guard a vital zone. This gave Izuku the perfect window to rain punch after punch on Bakugo's unprotected head. Left, then right, then left again, he made full use of his body's momentum. Fully prepared to end the fight with a full-force uppercut, the green-haired teen paused as his opponent stumbled back. Slowly, Bakugo sank to his knees. A half-second later, he collapsed forward face-first to the ground. The blonde was still half-conscious, unable to act any further. How disappointing, Izuku proclaimed in a rather dramatic fashion. All that bravado, all that hatred, and you couldn't even last a full round. Reaching into his back pocket, the green-haired teen withdrew a small metallic case. It might not have shown, but he was hurting all over, and his stomach demanded sustenance immediately. But Izuku wanted to complete the scene for his longtime tormentor, so he could have a glimpse at the bigger picture. You're not even worth the effort of capturing, Izuku continued, snapping open the case. Now, if you don't mind, I need to check on my pretty little partner. Feel free to wait here for the test to end, or crawl downstairs if you want a second round. I bet a real hero could do that. From the case, the green-haired teen picked out a small cylindrical object with rounded ends and placed it into his mouth. When it had become apparent that his healing resulted in severe hunger pains, he and his mother had cooked up some homemade candy, mixing in powdered nuts to add a little protein to the concoction. The candies had come out in shapes that reminded them of cigars, and Inko hadn't been able to help but point out how cool he'd look with them in his mouth. That comment had been immediately followed with pleas for him to not start smoking while he was still young. What a waste of time, Izuku said aloud as he left the room, leaving the semi-conscious Bakugo to seethe on the ground. The original Plan C had including capturing the blonde, but the blast to his abdomen had blown his capture tape away. Even so, the green-haired teen doubted the explosive teen would be able to reach two before time ran out, especially since there were multiple stairs in the way. Bakugo, for the time being, couldn't tell up from down, but he knew one thing. He'd just been bested by a nobody who didn't even have the right to even think of doing so. The blonde felt so humiliated he wanted to disappear. This couldn't be happening. In his mind, he'd seen it all. The freak cowering on the floor in fear of his obvious superiority, the justified beating he'd give, the victory he naturally deserved. The world wouldn't stop spinning, and even if it had, Bakugo was having little success at moving his unresponsive limbs. Then, like a miracle from the shitty gods themselves, his bracers flashed red and hummed. His secret weapon was finally ready to use. Against every screaming nerve in his body, Bakugo hauled himself along the floor, crawling as best he could forward. Overshadowing every agony the blonde felt as he moved was a bone-deep ache for one last shot at his nemesis. Romero was going down. The monitoring room. Did Midoriya just pull off a Dempsey roll? Eijiro Kirishima asked his classmates in surprise. The spiky redhead was amazed that such an old-school move worked in these modern times. Tokoyami merely crossed his arms, a look of understanding on his avian face. There could be little else one should expect from my fellow master of darkness, the raven-headed teen said, praising his friend in his own way. That brutish simpleton dared gaze into the abyss, and the void overwhelmed his mortal coil. Beside her overdramatic classmate, Momo was covering her mouth in revulsion at the level of violence she'd just witnessed. At the same time, the mature teen could understand the tactics demonstrated. Midoriya had fought the smart way, ensuring through his control of the flow of combat that his opponent could never use his quirk to the fullest. Way to go, Midoriya, Jiro praised, punching the air in excitement. It had been too long since the punk rock girl had been so electrified by a fight. Ojiro eyed his celebrating classmate with a frown. The martial artist had to use a bit of his training to keep his tail from twitching in agitation. Should you really be cheering for the villains? The tailed teen asked quietly. As much as he could agree that defeating Bakugo was a good thing, showing support for the bad guys still felt wrong. All Might, smile still in place, didn't like what he'd seen one bit. The level of hatred shown by young Bakugo, the ruthless cunning displayed by young Midoriya, it was just wrong. The pro-hero could sort of understand the green-haired teen's reasoning. He'd heard how worried the boy had been over young Azui getting caught in their explosive crossfire, but to go so far as to humiliate the blonde? It left a bad feeling in the number one hero's gut. Maybe if the symbol of peace had known Izuku's capture tape had been destroyed, he would have thought differently. But as the green-haired teen's communication bead had been ruined by that explosion to the face, he didn't. Sight of the faux weapon. Izuku-en, what happened? Tsuyu immediately asked as Izuku entered the room, his clothes burnt and in tatters. Are you all right? Karo. The green-haired teen smiled reassuringly at his partner, thankful for her concern. He also gave a smile to Tei, who was sitting on a trussed-up Ida, standing guard. I'm fine. Everything hurts, but I'm fine, Izuku said, coming to stand next to the frog girl. But Bakugo's not coming, though. Tsuyu frowned at this. She couldn't stop staring at her partner's belly. How could it look so unblemished, yet the reinforced clothes that were supposed to protect it were a mess? What does that mean? Karo, Tsuyu asked in concern. Izuku shrugged, gently lowering himself until he was sitting next to the frog girl's side. He waved a hand non-committally through the air. I lost the capture tape, but left him with a concussion, Izuku explained as Tsu began poking his stomach in barely concealed wonder. He's not making it back this far before time runs out. We've won. From his position on the floor, looking like a mummified cocoon due to the amount of capture tape enveloping him, Ida shook his head furiously until his mouth was free. He'd have moved more, but it turned out a zombie girl weighed much more than he'd thought. Impossible, the bespectacled teen exclaimed. How could you have defeated him with such differences in quirks? In an obvious attempt at ignoring their opponent, Tsu narrowed her eyes at the object hanging from her partner's mouth. Do you smoke? The frog girl asked, making Izuku smile. Do you want one? The green-haired teen asked in return, offering up his small case. Realizing after examining the contents that her partner wasn't suggesting she take a cancer stick, but enjoy candy, Tsu gladly agreed. She decided a celebratory toast wouldn't kill them. After all, there was only a minute left to wait before they'd win. Through unimaginable pain and suffering, Bakugo had managed to haul himself to the second floor. He'd added to his misery each time he'd rolled down a flight of stairs, but he knew from overhearing Four Eyes that this was where he'd found the bomb. The world might have never stopped spinning, his head might have felt like it was going to explode any minute, and his legs might have refused to hold him even now. But the blonde was too focused on unleashing his secret weapon on the freak to notice or care. That singular purpose was why the explosive teen had crawled his way here through agony, why he'd pushed his body past its limits and stood up so he could lean against the wall for support as he hobbled along. Why, as he began to hear voices and laughter around the upcoming corner, he redoubled his efforts to get into firing range. As the beaten-down blonde turned the corner, just making out the freak's shape through the far-off door, he knew. Nothing was going to stop him now. Beer. The villain team wins. All Might's booming voice filling the test building was the last thing Bakugo wanted to hear. He'd lost, and now nothing could wash away his disgrace. But, as the blonde watched his nemesis from across the distance, how the freak smiled like an idiot to someone or something outside his vision, he came to a decision. Test or no test, he had to erase the cause of his life's only defeat from existence. So, Bakugo readied his bracer, cocking back the large handle, and placed his finger through the pin. Izuku had just given Tei an order to free the still fuming Ida, who looked quite upset over his embarrassing defeat, when a glint through the open doorway caught his eye. Turning, the green-haired teen had only a second to react as he saw a bloodied Bakugo aiming his grenade-like arm guard in his general direction. Using that fraction of time, the verdant hero in training pushed away a startled Tsu, just as a truly cataclysmic explosion rocked the entire building to its foundation. The detonation was so massive in yield that none of the teenagers in the room could do more than flail around in the face of its might. Two support pillars took direct hits, immediately collapsing into scorched rubble and taking the ceiling and parts of the next two floors with them. Ida, having miraculously stayed conscious during the disaster, took a moment to take stock of his situation after the world stopped shaking. His ears were ringing so hard they hurt, and he could feel a wet sensation running down his face from his forehead. Ignoring what he knew that to be, the bespectacled teen tried to peer through the mountain of wreckage in the room for signs of his classmates. His stomach sank. There was nothing but rubble. That was until he caught sight of the zombie girl desperately trying to dig her way through a huge pile of debris. Midoriya, Azui, Ida shouted in horror as he realized what had happened. It was like a horrible tragedy unfolding before him. Thanks to the capture tapes still restraining him, the bespectacled teen couldn't join the effort to save his classmates. Two new wet sensations ran down his face now, in stereo, and the speedster couldn't ignore these ones. Bakugo basked in the aftermath of unleashing his secret weapon, drunk on the sight of such destruction, such evidence of his indisputable power. He felt like everything was back on track now, as if he was one step closer to becoming number one now that he'd finally defeated the green-haired shit-stain for good. The blonde's moment of glory was short-lived, however, as he was violently cast aside by an incoming mob. Midoriya, Tokoyami screamed in distress as he rushed into the room, Dark Shadow pushing Bakugo to the side without a word so his path would be unimpeded. The raven-haired teen had been the first to dart out of the monitoring room as soon as everyone had realized that the explosive blonde really was going to launch an attack even though the test had ended. He'd been seconded by All Might, although that was only because the pro hero had spent a precious few seconds calling for Midoriya and Azui to answer their mics before running. The rest of the class had followed suit, each as worried for Izuku and Tsuyu as the other. What the? Bakugo was still unable to process what had just happened when he suddenly felt a powerful hand pin him down. Within seconds, both of his bracers had been stripped from his battered arms. The squeal and crunch of crushing metal followed by two lumps of technological slag falling to the floor in front of his face clued the bewildered blonde as to what was happening. All Might knew from years of experience that the first thing to do in situations like this was to neutralize any danger of a second offensive, no matter how much the desire to save lives tugged at the heartstrings. That's why the number one hero had opted for restraining Bakugo and destroying his weapons before joining the rescue effort 1A had begun. Worse still, he knew he couldn't punch his way out of this, couldn't smash his way to a day saved. That would more than likely cause further harm to come to his buried students. They're still alive, Jiro exclaimed, having plugged her earjacks into the mountain of rubble. Using her quirk, the punk rock girl located the pair with ease, directing her classmates to help Tae. Surprisingly, the zombie girl was digging in the right direction. Beneath the wreckage, two pillars had collided with the fake bomb, tearing through the papier-mâché with ease, but still allowing enough drag to slow their collapse enough to create a small cavern between them. A single surviving light bulb flickered in the hollow, dangling from sparking wires. The dying light, as pitiful as it was enough for the two occupants of the space to take stock of their situation. When she could think again after the chaos of the explosion, Tsuyu examined herself as best she could. One of her arms was broken, if the bone sticking out was any indication, and she couldn't feel her legs. Normally that would have sent the frog girl into a blinding panic, but there was worse news. A large piece of rebar was sticking out of her stomach, and she could clearly see blood leaking out of the wound. Feeling the panic coming now, Tsuyu was distracted by movement to her left. Managing to turn her head just enough, she saw her partner. Izuku was a mess. One of his arms was nothing but charred flesh, and a fragment of glass was embedded in his right eye. Rebar had also pierced through the green-haired teen in multiple places. Remarkably, there was only a small amount of blood around him though. Izuku-kun, Tsuyu rasped out, hoping to get her partner's attention. Izuku suddenly moved, reaching for the glass in his eye. He gripped it tight, gave a sharp yank. God fucking damn it! The green-haired teen screamed, the glass leaving his eye socket without even a spurt of blood. After only a few seconds and blinks, he opened his eye. The emerald orb was good as new. Unnoticed, the charred limb had returned to normal, unblemished except for the surrounding dust, dirt, and ash smearing on it. Seemingly in a masochistic mood, Izuku then reached behind him and pushed, forcing himself off the rebar that was impaling him. God fucking damn it. This time the curse was hissed through clenched teeth, the metal sliding through him obviously more painful than the hero in training had expected. Nevertheless, in moments he'd managed to free himself, the resulting holes slowly starting to close. Karo, Tsu's call, weak as it had been, was enough to catch Izuku's attention. Seeing the frog girl's state, he quickly stumbled to her side. Taking his partner's hand in his, he gave her a reassuring squeeze before moving to apply pressure on her most grievous wound as best he could. The only thing running through the green-haired teen's mind the entire time was a single thought. This was just like Tay. I'm scared. Tsuyu gasped through her pain, her words causing her partner to shed tears of despair. Izuku knew that rescue was on its way, but he also knew that Tsu didn't have that kind of time. She was already getting cold, and All Might, usually everyone's best bet for salvation, wouldn't be able to use his unbeatable strength to save them before it was too late. 15 minutes to dig us out, at best. 5 to get you out of this spot as safely as possible. The nearest hospital is 20. Izuku rattled off projections, unable to say what he knew was the truth. Tsuyu allowed her normally stoic face to smile, just a little. Gently, she used the hand of her unbroken arm to cup her partner's face, stopping his muttering completely. Wide, desperate green eyes bore into resigned black. I'm not going to make it, the frog girl said in understanding. Accepting the fact, as scary as it was, Tsuyu still wished she could say goodbye to her parents and siblings before she died. Her parents would be devastated, no doubt. They'd been so anxious when she'd made it clear she wanted to go to hero school, and now this? Sammy Dare would act unaffected during the day, but she knew her little brother would cry every night in his room afterward. Satsuki wouldn't understand why Big Sis never came home from school. The little tadpole was just too innocent for that. The thought caused a tear to perl up. She'd at least hoped she'd have her first kiss before the end. I'm not letting you die, Izuku suddenly declared, pulling out his penknife. He just had to save this girl. He couldn't lose another person. There was a slight chance if he acted now, his quirk might actually be able to help. Noticing the tiny knife in her partner's hand, Tsuyu looked from the blade to Izuku in confusion. Karo, the world was beginning to fade in and out, so the frog girl decided maybe she was seeing and hearing things. Despise me, forgive me, resign yourself, Izuku intoned as he cut into his left wrist, causing Tsuyu's eyes to widen in shock. But I take this barbarous action to save your life. Now I want you to drink and live. Before the frog girl could react, the green-haired teen forced his bleeding wrist over her mouth, a rather large amount of the crimson liquid making it in. The two remained like that for a moment, neither moving. Perhaps it was her partner's words. Perhaps it was an instinctual fear of death. Whatever the cause, Tsuyu gave into her impulse and drank. She drank deeply, with the intent to survive the day. 20 minutes later, with the help of Achiko and Tokoyami and their quirks, the former rendering debris weightless for easy removal and the latter using dark shadow to handle large amounts of rubble, 1A was able to liberate their buried classmates without further issue. When the last concrete slab was raised and discarded, the class eagerly took in the forms of their missing number. Izuku cradled Tsuyu against his chest, what little had been left of his vest appearing to have been torn away to be used as bandages for the frog girl's wounds. Looking up at his classmates from where he crouched on in the open hollow, dried tears were clearly visible upon the green-haired teen's cheeks. It worked. Izuku breathed with a weak smile. It finally worked. The words meant nothing to the members of 1A, leaving them all standing confused in the ruined hall. While they did so, Tay stumbled down into the open space and took her customary place behind Izuku. Nobody noticed the zombie girl stood just a little closer to the green-haired teen than normal. Karo, Tsuyu's croak received smiles from the other girls before they noticed something odd. As the frog girl looked up at them with bleary eyes, There was no denying that what was once black was now red. "Can we go to the nurse's office now?" Tsu asked aloud. "I don't feel very good." The comment earned sighs of relief from all present. Momo, seeing she was the closest to the two rescued classmates, was the first to offer her hand in assistance. The mature girl recognized from his drooping gaze that Izuku was too weak and too tired to be of further help. "No!" Tsu's scream startled everyone, the frog girl sounding as if Momo had just threatened to kill her. She clung to Izuku as if her life depended on it. "Wait! Whatever you do, don't separate us," Izuku warned, holding Tsu closer to his chest even as his eyes cried out his pain at what he'd had to do. "I used my quirk on her, but I don't know what could happen if I'm not touching her to command my blood. I don't want her to die, or become like Tay." It was only now that the rest of 1A noticed the blood-covered rebar that rose from the once cavern like hungry teeth, their imaginations quickly filling in for them what had most likely happened. "Worry not, my friend," Tokoyami exclaimed, dark shadow rising from the aviantine's stomach. "Allow me to safely ferry you away from death's ever-reaching grasp." At the raven-headed boy's direction, the shadowy quirk entity shaped its hands into massive wing-like appendages. Gently, Izuku and Tsu were scooped up, dark shadow even carving into the ground effortlessly so the two wouldn't be jostled at all. All Might watched this all unfold feeling equal parts prideful and guilty. His students had reacted like real heroes in their joint effort to save their peers, but the knowledge that he was partially responsible for this tragedy was suffocating him. If he hadn't had the idea of pitting Izuku and Bakugo against one another in an effort to have the two work out their mutual hatred. The symbol of peace shook his head, barely holding onto his smile. Now he needed to prepare himself to face what was sure to be a most horrible of battles, dealing with the parents of the victims. A sinister aftermath. Nizu, the cute dog, mouse, bear, animal with a quirk that made him more intelligent than 99% of humans, looked back at the reflection that stared up at him from its mug of coffee. Sitting before the quirked animal while he sat at his desk were the pro-heroes Eraserhead and All Might, one looking beyond, tired to the bone, and the other in his civilian form. Both men were currently teachers at his school, and both currently wore the looks of guilty children who knew they were about to be scolded. As well they should. Their mistakes had ended up being nothing if not severe. Nizu, having been principal of the prestigious hero academy known far and wide as UA for many years now, knew officially something must be done promptly to prevent a massive loss of said prestige. However, the quirked animal couldn't help but feel his duty should have resided more in helping his students, not his institution. "So what happened?" Nizu asked, taking a sip of his coffee. He knew the general progression of events, of course, but a more in-depth report, not to mention important context, of what had led to their near tragedy could only be beneficial. Toshinori raised his hand faster than Aizawa could begin his explanation. "I made a judgment call, and it turned out to be wrong in the worst way," the skeletal man confessed. "I thought if the boys were allowed to battle, they'd work out their differences in the end." Aizawa glared at the symbol of peace as he took all of the blame and attempted to shoulder complete responsibility for the event. The gruff teacher was beyond angry, feeling no pity for the pro-hero's currently decrepit form. It was his belief that even as a freshly minted teacher, the man should have seen something like this coming. It was part of their job after all. "And why did you think your method could work?" Nizu asked, his cutesy voice doing nothing to take away from the principal's obvious seriousness. The quirked animal's form almost visibly oozed aggravation and irritation. "When I was a student, rivalries needed periodic confrontations to, vent frustrations at differences in rank or grades." Toshinori fumbled to explain. "I thought this was just one of those cases." Aizawa face-bombed at the top pro-hero's words, catching Nizu's sharp eye. "Something you'd like to share, Shudakuen?" The principal's words, while phrased as a question, were nonetheless tantamount to an order for the underground hero to speak. Aizawa didn't need further prompting. "For future reference, I wanted to be absolutely clear that this wasn't a simple case of rivalry," the gruff teacher opened. "There was no competition at all. Instead, it appears Midoriya regularly resisted acts of bullying and violence at the hands of Bakugo as far back as their early education." Toshinori paled at the information, unaware of how bad the two students' history truly was. Nizu narrowed his button eyes. The quirked animal hated many things about humans, but their capacity to inflict cruelty onto others for their own amusement was one he consigned some of his deepest hatreds to. If I'd been able to piece that information together from their clearly doctored files earlier, this entire fiasco could have been prevented, Aizawa continued, shoulders slumping. If I had, maybe my students wouldn't be in hospital beds right now. And thus it was that the gruff homeroom teacher of Class 1A revealed one of his longest-held secrets, that he did in fact feel something for his students. Just as quickly as it appeared, the concern was buried, the underground hero hiding the truth away to prevent those under his care from growing closer to him. He'd been hurt by such attachments before, and had sworn it would never happen again. I see. Nizu mused, a paw hand rubbing his chin. So, we can trace the root of this issue to an inexperienced teacher and tampered student files. I believe I understand. Toshinori and Aizawa glanced at each other before returning their attention to their boss. Whatever the quirked animal was thinking on, they were sure it was going to cause waves. In the meantime, Nizu broke from his musings, turning back to the men sitting at his desk. The parents of the victims were informed of their children's involvement in an accident, and while assurances of survival and location were provided, the mothers of course rightfully demanded access to their children. Toshinori and Aizawa gulped in sync. That was. No one has yet been told the entire truth of what occurred. Nizu pushed on, ignoring his teacher's looks of discomfort and dread. We need to decide on how to handle that. Who's going to meet them? The quirked animal was no one's fool. He knew whoever spoke with the, no doubt, enraged and worried. Mothers had a high chance of meeting an early demise. Toshinori began, starting to raise his hand again. The pro-hero accepted that he shouldn't avoid what he deserved. This whole near tragedy was his fault after all. I'll do it. Aizawa cut his coworker off. It's my responsibility as homeroom teacher, and they deserve to hear the whole truth. The gruff man stood up, ready to leave the office. He hoped meeting these women didn't kill him, responsibility or not. Toshinori sat, flabbergasted, as his normally emotionless colleague began to walk away. Unexpected didn't even begin to cover what had just happened. The top pro-hero had to take the burden back from his well-meaning associate. But I'm the one. You'll only make things worse, Aizawa said, cutting the symbol of peace off again. Sir, I'm sure you can find some other duties for All Might to be attending to right now. Leave this to me, and wish me luck. The underground hero closed the door behind him, marching off like a fearless soldier, and missed the solemn nod from the principal. Toshinori, meanwhile, was glad to see that the unexpected charity had just been a one-off, and his coworker was otherwise acting normal. That being said, the symbol of peace still gazed at the door, feeling like he'd failed to save someone, failed because of an inconsequential distraction. It reminded the pro-hero of all the times he'd had the other heroes of UA tell him there was nothing else he could have done to save more people. Only this time his crippling injury wasn't at fault. Well now, Nizu said, pulling out a file from a drawer in his desk, since Shudakuin's graciously gone to deal with the mothers of our victims, it appears we will now have to prepare to deal with the mother of our culprit. Here's to hoping the woman will be willing to listen to reason. The quirked animal's words made Toshinori wince. Even the skeletal man in all his social density knew a mother would defend her child against all reason. Medical office, 3 hours since the incident. The green-themed duo of Izuku and Tsuyu marveled at the advanced technology that filled every square inch of the room they found themselves in. It was a testament to UA's cutting-edge facilities. Both teens knew no hospital in Mizudafu would have been able to house the entire barrage of machines and scanners they'd had to suffer through in one place. Hell, even the IVs hooked into their arms were filled with a special in-house, high-quality nutrition-packed mixture. But really, all the gawking was actually a futile attempt to avoid acknowledging the position the two were currently in on their bed. I'm so happy you're alive, Izuku finally whispered, breaking the awkward silence. He'd lost his internal battle to contain his relief and lightly squeezed Tsuyu's hand. If he hadn't just gone through a life-and-death situation, the green-haired teen knew he'd have been too embarrassed to even do that. As it was, he was sitting half-naked in their hospital bed to allow better skin contact with the healed frog girl, so his face still resembled a tomato. What does that mean? Karo, Hugh asked, unable to hide her own embarrassment at the contact the two were sharing. In fact, the frog girl hadn't moved a muscle since the two had first made themselves comfortable on the bed, not daring to even turn around lest her savior see her rosy cheeks. Normally unflappable, the fact she was currently sitting between Izuku's legs while leaning against his bare chest, which was surprisingly soft, was causing Tsu's heart to flutter uncontrollably. The boy's warmth, which had at this point seeped into her bones, was almost mesmerizing. That I wouldn't be able to bear you dying? Izuku stuttered before cringing at his choice of words. No, wait. That sounded weird. I meant that I can keep seeing you. No, that's even weirder. That I get to see you smile. I am so dumb. Izuku fell into a muttering storm after that, and Tsu couldn't help but giggle at her savior's continued awkwardness. Perhaps the green-haired teen wouldn't be so tongue-tied if the frog girl's own suit hadn't been half removed and replaced with a hospital gown to prevent loss of skin contact. You make it sound as if you like me. Tsu found the courage to tease. While she knew the probability of a boy like Izuku actually finding her attractive were slim to none, the frog girl hoped her words would at least ease the tension between them a little. After all, who wouldn't find a mutant type like her, someone with the appearance of a frog, talking of desirability, humorous? Love at first sight, that romantic ideal all little girls seemed to hope for, had always been an unreachable dream for her. As far back as her early school days, bullies had constantly reminded her how ugly she truly looked. It can't be helped, Izuku replied with a sigh. You're just too cute, and I love cute things. The response had hardly left the green-haired teen's lips before he entered full panic mode, his companion stiffening in his arms. Did I just blurt that out loud? Izuku asked, getting more and more flustered as he spoke. I didn't mean that. I mean, you are pretty to look at. No, I mean, you have a cute laugh. Wait, no? I'm shutting up before I ruin our friendship. The green-haired teen cut himself off and lowered his head, forgetting that Tsu's own was just below his chin as she rested on his chest. The end result? Izuku found his nose buried in the frog girl's hair, where the scent of her shampoo turned out to be quite pleasant. Too pleasant to immediately turn away from. Tsu laid there, stiff as a board, completely caught off guard. It was too much. Hadn't she just thought about how impossible it was for someone to find her looks appealing? Her mind turning away from that utter unlikelihood. The frog girl was at least able to agree that Izuku cutting himself off had prevented the awkwardness from affecting their new friendship. And then a completely uncharacteristic thought entered Tsu's head. If a simple attempt at teasing had elicited such a response from the green-haired teen, maybe she should tease him a little more? After all, genuine or not, it wasn't every day a member of the opposite sex called her pretty. My laughter sounds like fast croaking. It's silly, but not cute, Tsu stated, before leaning in slightly with a playful look on her normally expressionless face. Are you sure you didn't mean something else? Izuku mumbled something into the frog girl's hair. Obviously unable to understand what was said, Tsu nudged her savior gently. The green-haired boy got the message, though, and leaned back with a sigh of his own. It sounded cute to me, Izuku said, flooring the girl in his arms. Tsu found herself forced to reconsider her earlier thoughts. Maybe there was a little ray of hope for someone like her after all. But even so, it wasn't worth the risk of such a new friendship that had just started. Tay's sudden and unexpected groan sounded an odd mix of playful and accusatory, earning a small eep from Tsu and a raised eyebrow from Izuku. It had come to no one's surprise that, after Izuku had passed out and been taken to Recovery Girl, the zombie girl had followed her master. And since his arrival, she'd refused to budge even an inch from his side, going so far as to cling to the green-haired teen's left arm. When Tsu had noticed this, and that it left the poor boy with only one arm to hold her, the frog girl had briefly entertained the idea that Tay was jealous. Really? Izuku asked, skeptical of the information his first partner had just related. In spite of that, he could feel heat rushing to his cheeks once more, an elated feeling budding at the prospect of it being accurate. That's not true. Tsu almost yelled. I'm not blushing. The frog girl felt an ungodly amount of heat flooding her cheeks, more than she'd ever felt in her life. She also felt the stirrings of agitation. She'd thought herself safe, her savior unable to see her face in their current position. But no, that just had to be ruined by a zombie girl who apparently loved to report everything. And then Tsuyu realized what had just happened. Tei had groaned, and she'd. I just understood her. Karo, Tsuyu croaked in alarm, unable to decide if that was a good thing or not. It definitely wasn't normal, though. Izuku smiled hesitantly, unsure if the frog girl was playing along or if she'd really been able to make sense of Tei's language. Oh, really? The green-haired teen asked. It might have been an unknown effect of his quirk. He hadn't ever used it on a living person before. Unfortunately, before Tsuyu had a chance to respond, Tei groaned again. This time, there was a recognizable questioning tinge to the sound. Of course I think you're cute too, Izuku replied with a smile for the zombie girl, who returned to nuzzling his arm. Don't be silly, Tei-chan. And that is how the three remained for a long while, content in their current positions. Outside Recovery Girl's nurse's office. For the past hour, Inko Midoriya and Baru Azui had been in a meeting with Shoyuta Aizawa, who'd spoken with them alone after they'd arrived. The mothers had been frantic after receiving notice that their respective children had been grievously injured during a training exercise, and had unloaded their emotional fury without mercy. The gruff pro-hero had then been subjected to maternal yelling, death threats, a declaration of intent to sue, and even the destruction of his favorite desk. Who'd known the Midoriya matriarch's quirk could lift something so heavy? All things considered, Aizawa had still believed himself extremely lucky. Things had gone far better than he'd expected at that point. I want to reiterate that both students are, as of now, stable, conscious, and fully capable of communication. Aizawa had repeated in vain attempts to put the two mothers at ease. Although, I will be the first to admit that this is in no way thanks to our own efforts. That last bit always earned the tired man penetrating glares from the women. I want you to take us to our children. Inko had eventually yelled out. My poor baby must be starving. The homely woman had been well aware of her son's limitations, and the backlash such quick and large-scale regeneration would have caused him. She'd brought with her a large bag packed with all manner of food and snacks for just that reason. But her efforts to see her baby had been met with little success until her last outburst. The green-haired woman's usually pleasant features might have spoken of a perpetual kindness, but the constant squeal of metal being bent and wood snapping told a much different story. An enormous fury long ago boxed away had been unearthed in the Midoriya matriarch. That her supposedly weak quirk had been oddly spiking in power since she'd received her call from UA was something the mother hadn't the time or inclination to capitalize on at the moment. Your son seems more heroic to me than the teachers at this academy, Baru had said in response to her fellow mother's demand. I would like to properly reward the boy for his effort to keep my precious daughter safe. Once they're recovered, let the Azui family treat you both to a proper reward, Karo. The words had been said in such a friendly and grateful tone, but Aizawa hadn't been able to forget the terrifying sight that the short woman had made when she'd first arrived. Thankfully, the pro-hero had made sure to step carefully from the beginning, acknowledging that these women were dangerous. One seemed to possess latent power she'd been unaware of, and the other held a position in society that could easily spell trouble for the academy. Only a fool crossed Baru Azui after all. The woman knew half of the best lawyers in Japan and employed the other half. In an attempt to calm the mothers, Aizawa had early on shown them the recordings of the exercise, audio included. It had been quite the eye-opener for the women. Inko hadn't been aware of how recklessly heroic her son could be, and Baru hadn't been able to believe her daughter's luck at finding such a knight in shining armor. The Azui matriarch had decided not to push the issue that day, but if Izuku Midoriya continued to prove his intentions were pure, then the woman had no problem with snagging the boy into an arranged marriage. Finding suitors for her treasured children would be hard enough as it was without letting such an opportunity pass. The mothers are finally here. Recovery Girl greeted as the adults finally neared her office. Inko and Baru tensed. The elderly heroine was blocking access to the room by standing in front of the door. Recovery Girl, this is Baru Azui and Inko Midoriya. Aizawa quickly made introductions before anything could be destroyed. Please, explain to them the current situation their children are in. Meanwhile, I'll go check on the other party involved. The pro-hero retreated as speedily as a business walk would allow, leaving a frowning Recovery Girl in his wake to fend for herself. Luckily, The elderly heroine had more years of experience dealing with difficult patients and distraught parents than her coworker had years of living under his belt. The sharp focus of the mothers hardly fazed her. Just how badly was my daughter wounded by that animal? Caro, Baru questioned, first to speak out after the gruff teacher's exit. The amphibian features of the woman's face, usually passive, were as stone-cold as her voice had turned. I hope you're giving my baby more than a mere 4. Inko followed her mother in arms almost immediately, the fierce frown twisting her normally bubbly visage, implying just how badly medics in the past had handled her baby's care. Recovery girl harumphed at the two mothers, slightly impressed that they'd been able to limit their questions and demands to one each. Usually this was the part where the concerned parent or parents would lose all control of themselves. The old nurse gave the women an acknowledging blink before beginning. For starters, Midoriya-san is hooked into 3 IVs. Although I'll permit him real food now regardless of standard protocol, the elderly heroine said. As for 2, perhaps I should explain before we go in. Recovery girl gestured to the sofa that sat outside her office in the hallway. Both mothers stiffly refused the offer with increasing worry and anger. The elderly heroine huffed, but wasn't offended by the actions of her guests. First off, your daughter is doing well, Recovery girl said, directing her gaze to Baru. Most likely, she'll even be able to return home tomorrow. And at this point in time, I can't see a reason why she couldn't attend classes by Monday. The frog woman noticeably sagged in relief at hearing that her eldest was going to recover just fine from her ordeal. One parent temporarily reassured, Recovery girl turned to the still anxiously waiting Inko. As for Midoriya-san, the elder heroine paused for a moment, considering how to word her next statement. To be honest, the only reason he's not going home this very moment is because we don't know what his quirk will do if he's separated from Azue-san. Baru, now confused, turned to her new friend and mother of her daughter's savior for an explanation. Inko's face, while still expressing her concern, had gained a sad, yet understanding aspect. Ah, that. The Midoriya matriarch murmured, almost half to herself. Shaking herself out of her thoughts, the woman turned to the other mother in the hallway. Izuka's only used his quirk like this once before, and the recipient's regeneration factor works at a faster speed when standing closer to him. My poor baby, he must be terrified right now of his friend turning into another Taichan. The explanation only added more questions the Azue matriarch wanted answers to, but for the moment she decided her focus was better spent gaining more understandable facts. To that end, Baru only nodded in response and turned back to Recovery girl. How badly was my daughter hurt? The frog woman asked the elderly heroine again. She hoped to get a better idea of what had happened from a medical professional. The grainy footage from the test cameras, damaged as they were, wasn't very helpful. What was the nature of the wounds, and how much did this Izuka boy heal himself? Knowing her daughter had been seriously injured was bad enough, but not knowing the extent was almost worse for the Azue matriarch. She also needed to know just how much she should be rewarding the younger Midoriya for his actions. The professional mask recovery girl had worn thus far slightly cracked. Even she wasn't looking forward to relating such injuries. But there was no way of avoiding it at this point, was there? Your daughter suffered a punctured stomach as well as multiple ruptures along her intestines, Recovery girl reported, already seeing the frog woman paling at the information. Her right arm shattered into 17 segments as well. There were also 5 vertebrae that received major fracturing, which caused her to lose the ability to feel anything below the waist. Inko watched as her new friend and fellow mother continued to appear more and more stricken with each word the elderly heroine spoke. The homely woman felt bad that she couldn't stand in solidarity with the frog woman, but her knowledge of injuries stopped that they barely affected her son. On top of those internal injuries, Azue-san experienced massive blood loss and the beginning stages of septic shock brought on by the toxins in her stomach seeping out and contaminating the surrounding organs. Recovery girl continued, regardless of the fact half her audience had frozen stiffer than a statue at her words. As much as it shames me to admit it, Azue-san, the only reason your daughter survived was Midoriya's quick action. Baru had long since passed mortified and was well into numbed shock. What had just been described to her was no mere accidental quirk use-related trauma brought on by a moment of emotional distress. The sheer scope of the injuries painted the culprit as one who was worse than a rabid animal. The Azui matriarch's eyes slide to the door the three women had been standing in front of. She feared what state she'd find her treasured daughter in when she went inside. This information was documented 3 hours ago. Recovery Girl broke Baru from her thoughts. But, as of now, Azusen only has a scar on her abdomen, hairline fractures along the bones in her arm, and no discernible signs of internal hemorrhaging. Both mothers snap their gazes to the elderly heroine in wonder at hearing how far the younger Azui's healing had progressed. The incident hadn't even occurred that long ago. Unfortunately, her stomach is a different story. Recovery Girl was quick to burst the two women's bubbles, never one to sugarcoat a situation. It's the only injury that hasn't properly healed yet. Although, considering how effective Midoriya's quirk seems to be, something might change overnight, I suppose. Inko frowned at the news that her son's quirk hadn't fully regenerated every wound the two teens had sustained already. That could only mean one thing. That's much slower than Taechan's. The Midoriya matriarch stated, drawing attention to herself. The homely mother's eyes widened. That means my baby's been starving since even before he had to help your daughter, Azui-san. Left unspoken was the fact that this made sense to the elderly heroine. She'd long since recorded the phenomena of the regeneration factor speeding up when Midoriya was hooked up to his IVs. Recovery Girl refused to risk angering the plump mother before her, as she really wanted to recruit her son for experimentation. A quirk like his was turning out to be ridiculously strong. Now, I'm about to let you both in, but before I do I need you to understand something. Recover Girl spoke, a silent warning clear to the now confused mothers. Since we don't know how Midoriya's quirk would react to separation, I've kept the two in constant contact. Close contact. The two women weren't sure what that meant, but surely it wasn't something to be too concerned about? How close? Karo, Baru asked while Inko thought over what could possibly be wrong. They're sharing the bed. Recover Girl deadpanned at the exact moment she opened the door, having decided to come clean and rip the band-aid off, as it were. Both mothers peeked into the room, curious to see how close their children had been for hours now. Karo. The single croak from Baru was enough to catch the attention of the two teens on the bed, both immediately blushing at being seen so close to each other, as in atop one another. Oh my! Inko gasped, though secretly the homely mother smiled internally. Seeing her darling boy be so daring as to hold a cute girl close to his bare chest was heartening for the oft-worried mother. Hesitantly, Izuku looked up from where his face had been buried in Tsuyu's hair. The green-haired teen fully expected to see the Azui matriarch going ballistic at the scene she'd walked into. I'm in trouble, aren't I? Izuku asked, worried voice tiny. However, even as anxious as he was, the hero in training never allowed his grip on Tsuyu to waver. In fact, the green-haired teen's hug on the frog girl only tightened, preventing any possibility of mishaps. Before any of the living occupants of the room could answer, the single undead present decided to put in her own 2 yen. Tae groaned loudly, letting go of Izuku's arm. The zombie girl lurched forward, standing between her master and the now startled mothers. Karo, Baru croaked again, this time in obvious fright as she jumped and hid behind Inko. The frog woman hadn't expected her first encounter with a zombie to happen like this. As quickly as Tae had moved, and Baru reacted, Inko took command of the situation. The homely mother calmly stepped forward and bopped the zombie girl on the head. Oh, hush now, Tae, Inko said with a half-smile. You're going to scare Baru-san. She doesn't know you yet, and that behavior is uncalled for. Now, would you please get us some chairs? Izuku won't be able to feed you until I've fed him. To the shock and surprise of the Azui matriarch and the observing Recover Girl, the zombie girl only gave a huff at the request before slowly leaving the room. In Principal Nizu's office, Mitsuki Bakugo sat, speechless at what she'd just witnessed. Before her very eyes, she'd watched recorded video plainly show her son, acting like a deranged psychopath, unleash utter destruction on his classmates. In the moments before the devastation, Katsuki's eyes had been wild with bloodlust, and after, when the massive and lethal attack had been carried out, manic pleasure. All Might's prior announcement of the exercise's completion had not only been clear even in the recording, but her son's reaction left no doubt he'd heard it. The fact that he'd then still decided to carry on with his assault was undeniable. Defending Katsuki was effectively impossible, And to the Ashen Mother, even damage control seemed to be a losing battle. So how are the victims? Mitsuki asked, hating to use the word, but knowing any attempt to downplay her son's actions would likely result in harsher punishment. Are the affected students doing okay? The Ashen Mother didn't try to kid herself. She knew there was little hope in this situation. The hammer was soon to fall. Glancing at her son, now clad in heavy arm, hand, and wrist restraints to prevent use of his quirk, her fears were anything but put at ease. The explosive blonde even had weighted chains locked to his legs to prevent him from fleeing. Young Midoriya appeared to have taken the worst of the attack, but he's perfectly fine now, All Might answered. That is, sans the constant complaints about his hunger. The news gave the troubled woman a small feeling of respite. The ashen blonde sat back, a weak smile on her face. Thank goodness. Mitsuki cheered the small victory. I'm so glad Kochan's boy is all right. The Ashen Mother felt a flicker of hope. Surely, at the very least, her best friend would be willing to forgive her and her son. She'd done it so many times before. Out of the corner of her eye, Mitsuki saw her son bite his lip, hard, a clear sign he was forcing himself to keep quiet. She highly doubted he wanted to apologize. As for young Ida, he suffered slightly less mortal wounds. Nizu picked up. The quirked animal's chosen words did their job, reminding the Bakugo woman with a start that just because Izuku Midoriya had already healed didn't mean he hadn't been grievously injured. He was taken to his family's private hospital of choice for treatment of a concussion and dislocated shoulder. Mitsuki sighed in relief again. Injuries like that, while their circumstance was dire, wouldn't see her son in prison. Tensei Ida, the Ida family's current public face and de facto head of house, has made it very clear he intends for you to pay all medical fees, Nizu continued, forcing down a vindictive smirk at the now dread-filled eyes of the elder Bakugo. He decided to hammer in another nail. He has also stated he will side with the Azui family should they decide to pursue legal action. The worst-case scenario hit Mitsuki like the horrible nightmare it was. Katsuki's eyes widening at the news only worked to confirm her fears. Suddenly the chains on her son seemed like they'd never be removed. I understand. The Ashen Mother whispered half-heartedly. Surely there had to be something, anything, that could lessen the troubles piling upon her family? As if to prove how erroneous her wishful thinking was to be, Nizu passed Mitsuki a manila folder. Before she even opened it, a knot formed in her stomach. Whatever was bad enough the principal of UA would rather it be read than spoken surely wasn't good news. Speaking of the Azui, was all Nizu said. Mitsuki opened the folder and immediately wished she hadn't. Inside was a detailed list of all of the injuries her son's classmate had suffered, as reported directly after the event. Each was worse than the last, and whatever quivering hope the Ashen Mother had held vanished. Now she only saw a future of darkness, not only for her son, but for her entire family. Fortunately, Midoriya managed to successfully utilize his quirk while the two were trapped by debris. Nizu broke Mitsuki's dismal thoughts, allowing the woman more time before her world came crashing down. She will not only survive, but may even make a full recovery. Nizu raised a paw hand before the hopeful look on the blonde mother's face could return to more than a flicker. This doesn't mean that your son's actions will be forgiven or forgotten, the quirked animal said forcefully. Psychological damage has yet to be determined for any of the three, and that's not even mentioning the Azui family's absolute right to press criminal charges. Seeing his point had been made when Mitsuki's shoulders slumped, Nizu took a breath. And then there's the fact that our own rules will fully apply here, the principal revealed. That means for all intents and purposes, Katsuki Bakugo will be expelled from UA forthwith as soon as the appropriate authorities have concluded their investigation of the scene and processed all available evidence. The blonde mother felt conflicted. On one hand, she was incredibly thankful for the cinnamon roll her best friend called a son. On the other, it was devastating to hear her own son's dream had just been ended so completely. At least there was the faintest of hopes that her family could survive the ordeal now. And maybe something could still be done for Katsuki? Is there a way? Please reconsider? Mitsuki choked out in a broken voice. It might be too much to ask, but a second chance could. Katsuki watched as, for the first time in his life, his proud and strong barbarian of a mother was reduced to a weak, pleading mouse. It didn't sit well with the explosive blonde, and if he'd been able to, he'd have cursed up a storm to get the hag back to her normal self. This wasn't her. She never begged. What the hell? Mitsuki swallowed her ego, venturing to ask for her son to have a chance he didn't deserve. For all the faults between them, she did love him. Unfortunately for the Ashen mother, her appeal came at the exact moment a rather gruff-looking man entered the office. No, Aizawa bit out, an unusual amount of emotion in his rough voice. And if it were up to me, your spawn would be thrown into Tartarus for the rest of his life. Age be damned. The harsh statement received mixed reactions around the room. Nizu only sighed at his prickly teacher's words, though he knew the underground hero's history and why he would say such a thing. Mitsuki paled at the mere mention of her son being locked away in the world's worst official criminal cesspool. Bakugo silently fumed, itching to blow something up. And All Might, Aizawa-kun, isn't that taking things a bit too far? The symbol of peace asked, trying to calm the sudden tension that had gripped the room. After all three students will. Katsuki Bakugo voluntarily attacked his fellow students with lethal force after their exercise had been ended, appearing to be quite pleased with himself during and afterward the assault. Aizawa cut the number one hero off, not having any of the muscle-bound idiot's mercy. He did this either fully aware of the consequences, or while unable to think rationally about them. Either way, this means that the only alternative I see is to have him committed to a psychiatric institution. The underground hero's harsh evaluation caused both Bakugos to wince. Be that as it may, Nizu interrupted his disputing teachers. As the principal of this prestigious academy, I've decided to allow a single chance for this student of ours that's fallen from the heroic path. He'll take it. Mitsuki quickly accepted, the troubled mother not even willing to give the quirked animal time to explain or her son to say anything. Nizu shook his head, a humorless chuff escaping him at the eagerness of the Ashen woman to salvage some future for her child. He'd looked over Mitsuki Bakugo's file before the woman had arrived, and even with his distaste for most humans, the principal found himself somewhat pitying the woman for the suffering her son's actions was causing her. I appreciate the enthusiasm, but allow me to fully explain before attempting to agree to something only your son can, Nizu said. First of all, Bakugo-san will be removed from the hero course forthwith, and instead be enrolled in the general studies track. Concurrently, any use of his quirk, under any circumstance, will be completely restricted until he passes a battery of evaluations from our own psychiatrists. After that, he will be placed under provisory surveillance until such a time that he has earned the right to return to the path of heroes. And do keep in mind, this is only in addition to any and all punishments the authorities decide. He did cause potentially lethal damage to 3 of our students after all. As the quirked animal explained his terms, Katsuki felt his ever-present rage flare to life. The explosive blonde was more than ready to call bullshit on this whole farce and demand a return to his rightful place. That is, until he saw the absolutely terrifying glare the hag was directing at him. In the face of that supreme power, Katsuki was forced to bow his head and accept any and all terms that came with the deal. He accepts, Mitsuki repeated, placing a heavy hand on her son's non-responsive shoulder. The brooding blonde gave a forced nod. Nizu clapped his paw hands together, expecting nothing less from what he knew of the 2 ashen blondes before him. Excellent. Now, all we have left is to wait for the mothers of your son's victims, the quirked animal revealed. They more than deserve to have their say in all this. And of course, should they choose to press charges, we won't be able to do much with Bakugo-san. We can't have a student in the hero course that's been convicted of such violent crimes. We'd be pushing it with the restriction order as it is. Mitsuki froze, despair washing over the ashen mother once again at the revelation. Aizawa just snorted at the principal's last-minute disclosure. Back at the nurse office, Baru Azui watched silently as her fellow mother interacted with the 2 teenagers on the hospital bed. It was easy to notice the closeness of the Midoriya family. Their warm actions spoke of much love and support. The frogwoman was surprised at how protective the young green-haired boy was even after only being friends with her daughter for less than a day. When Siyu had told her about a classmate that could control zombies, Baru hadn't known what to expect. The cinnamon roll that was holding her daughter so fiercely had definitely not been in her ballpark, though. The most unexpected detail of the scene however, was how happy her precious daughter looked. "Here, this is the last one I had time to make," Inko said as she handed Izuku his fourth burger in a row. The green-haired teen wolfed the home-cooked meal down like he'd been starving for days. "Tomorrow I'll cook up something more filling when you get home." Suyu giggled at the display of her savior chowing down so heartily. That was another thing Baru hadn't expected to come out of today, hearing a sound she hadn't heard in months. Inko had warned the frog woman that Izuku's regeneration was limited by the amount of nutrients he had in his body, and if the recording of the exercise was anything to go by, the boy had to have been extremely weak when he'd gone and saved her daughter, just like her mother-in-arms had said earlier. Taking such a potentially life-threatening risk for the sake of just a friend? It was incredible to think about. Tay groaned while holding up a bottle of water toward Izuku. The zombie girl obviously was trying to help her master, but showed no hostility toward Tay when she was the one that took the offering from her hands. Baru had originally been fascinated by the reanimated corpse because if she hadn't known better, with its obedient demeanor and lifelike appearance, the frog woman would have easily believed Tay was only a girl with Down syndrome. The zombie girl's existence was also troubling, as the mother had quickly noticed the change to her daughter's eyes. "So what happened to this girl could still happen to my daughter?" Baru finally asked, hating to put such a stressful question out there. But as a mother she needed to know. It was Izuku who answered, looking equally as distraught as he did relieved. "I don't think so, ma'am. When I failed to save Tay, she'd already died before my quirk could repair any of the damage," the green-haired teen explained. "And she didn't seem to want to survive. Suchan, though, she fought for her life while I gave her my blood. Since she's herself now, I can't imagine her turning into a mindless zombie. She's also very much alive." The hero in training did his best to convey his thoughts, not failing to notice to leaning into him a little more as he did so. Unfortunately, that same observational prowess missed the frog girl's mother staring intently at her daughter's action. "And her red eyes?" Baru asked, more out of curiosity than worry. A simple change of eye color was a lot easier to accept than her daughter suffering crippling wounds or death. The frog woman was also careful to keep a piece of her intuition to herself. The zombie girl wasn't as mindless as others believed her to be. She was an office worker, and she had faith in her ability to spot a mindless drone or a brain-dead person. Previously sitting at her desk, watching the scene unfold, Recovery Girl took the opportunity to reintroduce herself into the conversation. "I can answer that," the elderly heroine announced, drawing the attention of everyone present. Midoriya-san's blood is actually made of cells that appear to be almost sentient. They can form symbiotic relationships with organic structures they come into contact with. And since the eyes are connected to the brain, it appears the cells recognize the entire ophthalmic apparatus as an invaluable resource against external threats. Therefore, portions of the quirked blood relocated to the Azui-san's optic organs and related nerves to ensure a redundant communication network with the brain and the rest of the cells. Seeing she'd lost most of her audience, Recover Girl chuckled and waved a gloved hand, getting to the point. Once Midoriya-san's blood is purged from Azui-san's system, her eyes should return to their normal color. If the elderly heroine happened to forget to relate some of the other potential she'd discovered with the green-haired boy's quirk, well, she was old after all. "Oh my, I knew there was a better explanation to it than your blood just repaired stuff." Inko's cheerful voice broke the relieved silence that followed Recovery Girl's words. The homely mother found great delight in the news, seeing a much brighter future for her son. Of course, she'd never suggest getting rid of Tay. The zombie girl had become quite useful at home by taking over many of the simple and repetitive chores. He still needs to stay in contact with the girl, though, Recovery Girl added before anyone could get distracted further. At this point in time, there's no way to predict how his quirk will act without proper direction, or in this case, direct and active concern in regards to keeping Azui-san intact as a person. Regardless, if her healing continues at its current progression, her wounds will be completely gone by tomorrow. I advise waiting to test separating them until then. The elder heroine was expecting her words to garner a few reactions, not the least of which was an angry Azui matriarch upset about her daughter participating in such a lengthy skinship session with basically a stranger. She was surprised, therefore, to find the frogwoman's expression much more understanding than she'd foreseen. "I understand," Baru said, accepting the news as graciously as possible. Inko-chan, your son has a truly marvelous quirk, both powerful and miraculous. I'm grateful for his existence, because without him no one would have been able to save my treasured daughter. Please allow me to treat you both to lunch tomorrow, as I have a feeling Izuku here will still be hungry, Karo. You're too kind, Baruchan. We'd gladly take you up on your offer, Inko said cheerfully, glad her new friend accepted her son so readily. I think it'd be a great time to reintroduce ourselves, as I'm sure our children have a lot to tell us. The homely woman's schoolgirl-like giggling worried the two teenagers, who could only watch as their mothers plodded away. Now, while I'm sure that you're both beyond reassured about the well-being of your children, Recovery Girl trailed off as she gently guided the two mothers to the door. If you would please head to the principal's office, there are some legal matters that need your attention. Acquiescing to the elderly heroine's direction, Baru and Inko allowed themselves to be led from the room, neither mother even thinking to leave a warning about good behavior. Both were either confident that they'd raised their child with manners, or didn't mind any misbehavior that could occur. Now alone again, Tsuyu and Izuku returned to their previous position, the frog girl tucked as tightly as possible under the green-haired teen's arms. I think mother likes you, Tsuyu eventually said after a minute of silence, earning a chuckle from her savior. I would certainly hope so, Izuku replied, smiling down at the girl in his arms. I don't think I'd survive being told to stop being your friend. The words caused a warmth to travel through the frog girl, and Izuku unconsciously tightening the arm he had around her stomach didn't help. Tsuyu felt herself blush. Izuku, what happens if we need to stay like this to prevent me from going? Hey, Tsuyu asked, suddenly rising a concerning possibility. So far, it had been a dream come true for the frog girl to be treated like a normal person for so long, to not hear any remarks about her amphibious appearance, to not feel rejected for her looks. But even so, this had been a controlled environment until now, and once the true extent of her savior's quirk came to light, she knew without a doubt there'd be other girls who saw Izuku as attractive. She feared becoming a burden to her savior if she had to stay close to him at all times, especially if he had other, prettier girls clamoring for his attention. Su-chan, if that happens, then I'd gladly stay by your side for the rest of my life, Izuku replied, resting his chin on the frog girl's shoulder. The innocent action caused Tsuyu's heart to skip a beat. Said heart was forced by some internal power to return to its proper tempo. You really mean that? Tsuyu asked, ready to kiss her savior's cheek. She was so full of thanks. In fact, she moved to do just that. Yes, I do, Izuku reaffirmed, raising his head back up to get a good look at the girl in his arms. He wanted to show her how confident he felt about his actions. Then the green duo felt their noses collide. Their eyes met. Time stopped, and the world fell away for the teenagers as they realized how close their faces were. Their lips had opened due to synchronized gasps of surprise, and warm breath ghosted across their respective cheeks. Izuku couldn't move, his hormones waging a rebellion inside. He craved to lower his face that final half-inch, but his strong morals kept him from succumbing. The green-haired teen knew this instant had just been an accident. Tsuyu felt oddly warm all over, and her heartbeat sang to her a sweet song of tilting her head back, just that final half-inch. She should close the distance, seal the gap, and claim her savior before any other girl had the chance. It was completely irrational, and probably a result of the so-called suspended bridge effect, but the frog girl felt her body begin to move anyway. And really, she didn't feel like stopping it. Midoriya, my friend, I have recovered for you your withheld items. Our classmates Hagakure and Ishido proclaimed their intentions of returning Azure-sans to her. Tokoyami announced dramatically as he entered the room. Have they fulfilled their vow yet? The raven-headed teen immediately froze upon seeing the position Izuku and Tsu were in, before looking away hastily out of respect. He ended up looking right at the aforementioned girls, who'd already been in the room. Oh, there they are. Tokoyami deadpanned, staring with clear disapproval at Mina Ishido, who had her phone aimed at the pair in their bed. We didn't want to interrupt, came Toru's shy voice, and used to being caught in situations like this. The invisible girl wished not for the first time that she'd taken her clothes off when she'd had the chance. Mina, meanwhile, giggled like a madwoman. That's right, this was getting really good. The pink-hued girl exclaimed. This is going to be a very popular vid. Hey, The acid user was completely unprepared for her phone to be yanked from her hand by something incredibly fast and agile. Looking around, Mina found that Tsuyu had used her tongue to retrieve the device, only to pass it to Izuku. "I'm deleting this." Izuku deadpanned, poking at the phone's touchscreen. He easily erased the video before going through the options and expunging everything from the last hour, just in case his pink-hued classmate had thought to take pictures too. Seeing her phone being snapped away, Mina made a mad dash to recover her phone. After only a step, a now angry-looking Tay tackled her to the ground. Tsuyu decided her best option was to cover her face, although that did nothing to hide her massive blush. Even with only knowing Mina as long as she had, the frog girl knew the acid user was the kind of person to relentlessly tease her about this incident in public. By next week, everyone will have heard in some form or another about what had transpired in the nurse's office. As she watched her fellow gossip queen be pinned by their classmate zombie, Toru quickly pocketed her own phone. The invisible girl decided not to say anything about her own haul, since she'd actually been able to take pictures before Tokoimi had entered the room, and just enjoy the fact that she had an incredible source of teasing material for later. There was gold in her pocket, Toru knew, and she wasn't about to miss her spot at the party. A sinister reaction. Tsuyu was dreaming. There could be no other possible explanation. Why else would she be laughing so openly when normally she'd keep her emotions more in check? Why else would she be indulging in something so childish as happily jumping up and down in place, flailing her arms around in complete glee? Her surroundings screamed pleasant childish dream as well, from the emerald sun bathing the world in its viridescent light to the dark green and fluffy grass that carpeted the ground to the horizon. Silliest of all was what the frog girl found herself laying on. Kero, 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 Kero. Tsuyu laughed some more, like there was no tomorrow. She was finally free of her own self-consciousness. That iron certainty, her amphibian features were undesirable. Instead, she was suffused in the same elation that had come when someone had told her that her laughter was cute. Looking down, Tsuyu laughed again at the giant buttercream icing-soaked cinnamon roll she was laying atop of. The confection was so large and comfortable she could have used it as a bed, a sweet bed so fragrant it felt like her nose would be able to find it anywhere on the planet. The warmth coming from the baked goods was also so warm that as long as the frog girl touched it, she knew no winter would be able to force her into hibernation. Of course this was a dream, and a silly one at that. Tsuyu would have expected one of her siblings to have enjoyed such a fantasy, but she was surprised how happy it was making her. "I don't know how, but I'm going to eat you whole. Kero, 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 Kero," the frog girl declared, and then laughed as she buried her face into the spongy pastry. Then she had a thought. With a mischievous smile adorning her face, Hugh decided on marking this glorious find for herself in such a way that not even her siblings at their brattiest could make her share it. She licked it, slowly and sloppily. "Titi Tsujan." The voice of her savior resounded in the frog girl's ears, causing her to blink back to reality in surprise. The silly dream world disappeared, the emerald sun morphing into Izuku's blushing face. Tsuyu's giant, delicious cinnamon roll transformed as well, becoming the green-haired teen's bare chest, which she was still licking. "Kero." The startled croak burst from Tsuyu's throat as soon as she realized where she was and what she was doing. Trembling in mortification, she retracted her tongue. Despite her naturally lowered capacity to perceive taste, the frog girl could unequivocally claim to have a good and permanent impression of the flavor of the boy she'd been using as a bed. That thought, followed by the realization that her actions no doubt appeared incredibly lewd, caused Hugh to begin blushing heavily. What could Izuku possibly think of her now? Why did you? Izuku couldn't get his mind together enough to even ask the question that was begging to be answered. His mind couldn't form a plausible explanation for his new friend's behavior. Granted, she'd been moving around for a while now, and had cuddled up to him pretty much the entire night, but he'd assumed it was due to her nature. Since the frog girl was most likely cold-blooded, having a warm body next to her would have definitely been too much for her instincts to resist. Tsuyu buried her face into her savior's chest in a futile attempt to hide her embarrassment. Trying to kickstart her brain, the frog girl tried to think of something she could say, anything really, that could salvage the situation. "It was a dream, Kero," Tsuyu said before she could stop herself. The ambiguous statement hadn't been the best response possible, in the frog girl's opinion, but it was too late now. What if the green-haired teen assumed she'd been dreaming about him? Instead of jumping to accusations like she thought he would, Izuku only hugged Tsuyu closer. I'm going to take a leap of faith here and assume you were dreaming about food? The green-haired teen's one-armed hug, due to Tay still being glued to his left side the entire night even though she didn't need sleep, made the frog girl feel much better. This could work for her. Tsuyu limited her response to a wordless nod into her savior's chest, avoiding eye contact at all costs. The convenient half-truth was enough for her to get a handle on her embarrassment, but she wasn't going to take any chances that might damage the two's new friendship. Well, that explains it. Izuku consoled the girl in his chest. You haven't had food since yesterday. Your stomach no doubt finished healing overnight, and you must be starving now. Tay, bring me the case, please. Izuku's sudden order caught Tsuyu off guard, but not as much as when the green-haired teen began to raise the bed to reach a sitting position. Karo, the frog girl's croak, in all tones and forms, was becoming one of Izuku's favorite sounds. However, remembering what had happened last time he'd tried to praise his classmate's cuteness, he refrained from commenting this time out of fear of creeping her out. Following her master's command, Tay carried over a small case from the other side of the room. It was the same case Izuku had carried his cigar-shaped candies in. I know we should really wait for Recovery Girl's approval, Izuku said as Tay placed the case in his waiting hand, but I think a bit of sugar will do wonders for your hunger right now. Popping open the metal container, sure enough, the green-haired teen picked out a candied cigar. With a smile, Izuku handed the faux cancer stick to his bedmate. As Tsuyu began to suck and lick at the piece of candy, she finally felt her stomach beginning to work again. And just as Izuku had said, the frog girl found herself incredibly hungry. Unfortunately for her, for all that it was tasty, the candy didn't match up to the cinnamon roll she'd dreamed about. The green-haired teen continued to smile as his friend chewed down on the candy he'd given her, gently patting her head due to how cute she looked doing so. Her adorableness was off the charts, and he could barely restrain himself from hugging the girl in his lap. It was a scene of pure diabetes-level sweetness, a scene suddenly broken by a curt-sounding cough. Didn't you two promise not to get carried away with the mood? Recovery Girl asked, standing at the door with her arms crossed. Seeing that the two teens in the bed appeared confused by her observation, the nurse continued. I could have turned a blind eye to walking in on you spooning like old lovers. But this youthful lotus position. The stern descriptor was enough for the teens to finally look down and notice how they'd been positioned. Somehow, Tsuyu had ended up straddling Izuku, happily leaning on his bare chest. Her hospital gown, nowhere in sight, had been lost overnight due to not being tied to leave her back exposed. The end result? The frog girl was left in only her sports bra and the lower half of her costume, tattered as it was. Coupled with Izuku's own bare torso, the image presented left for quite the lascivious impression. Faces simultaneously caught fire as both teens locked eyes. The green duo suddenly noticed how their bodies were beginning to respond to more hormonal impulses and fervently wished no one else would enter the room until they had an opportunity to separate and dress. Explaining their position would be incredibly difficult without becoming even more mortified. Then, as if called by the teens' desperate wishes, two more women entered the nurse's office without any warning. Izuku, I brought you breakfast, Inko happily announced as she entered the room along with her new best friend Baru. Taking in the scene they'd walked into, the homely mother could hardly express her surprise. Oh my! The fact the Midoriya matriarch said this with a smile was lost on the two red-faced teens. Karo, Baru's reaction wasn't much different from her fellow mothers. The frog woman almost sounded delighted by what she was seeing. This isn't what it looks like. Karo, Tsuyu quickly cut in, trying to defuse the situation as she perceived it. The last thing the frog girl wanted was for her mother to suddenly hate her savior, or for the green-haired teen's mother to think she was some wickedly perverted girl. Izuku watched, absolutely confused, as both mothers winked at each other while accepting Tsuyu's frantic words with matching smiles. The frog girl's word vomit was only ended when Recovery Girl returned and announced it was time for the final scan to be made. The elderly heroine repeatedly mentioned how it wasn't necessary for them to change positions. The examination lasted several minutes. as Recovery Girl checked in every way conceivable to make sure the regeneration had been a success. In the end, the elderly heroine found no worrisome signs and gave the teens the green light to begin separating. Oddly enough, this proved to be a bit more difficult than first believed, as Tsuyu found it hard to work up the nerve to let go of Izuku's hand, for fearing of suddenly dying. Meanwhile, Katsuki Bakugo sat on his bed, unable to take his eyes off the oversized bracers he was wearing. He knew about this kind of hardware and what it was used for. The police would be immediately notified if he even attempted to use his quirk. The shackles were famous for usually being worn by criminals going through rehabilitation or those awaiting trial. The blonde wasn't an idiot. He knew what kind of trouble he'd landed in. Still, the fault rested entirely at the feet of his arch-nemesis. That the damnable coward had purposefully positioned himself so others would be hurt by his justified attack. The explosive teen had a problem, though. This wasn't just a matter of settling a score with the only piece of shit he'd never been able to break into submission anymore. This time, his entire family was being involved, and for once, things weren't bending to his favor as they usually did. "Fucking Romero, this is your entire fault," Bakugo muttered, his mind tying itself into knots as it tried in vain to twist the events to his benefit. There was no way he'd fucked up. No way he'd have to plead for mercy to keep his family from being destroyed. No way his dream was on the line. Downstairs from the smoldering teen, Mitsuki was on the verge of breaking down, the parting words from her now ex-best friend reverberating in her ears. The homely woman had every right to be enraged, though, she knew. There was no denying her son had tried to murder Izuku, almost succeeding in killing an innocent bystander in the attempt. The other words that haunted the Ashen Mother were those of Buru Azui, her son's other victim's mother. "I'll see you in court." The frog woman's words were both searing iron and icy water, leaving Mitsuki with hot and cold spikes as she thought on the dismal prospects of her family's future. Even the woman's scant dreams offered no comforts. She'd seen nothing but visions of her son spending the rest of his days jailed, her husband working double shifts at a fast food joint after losing his job due to the scandal, and herself being forced into prostitution just to pay fines and the medical bills of her son's victims. And all of this had come about because for all her trying, she'd somehow failed to drill into her son's thick head that power required responsibility. At least, there's still one chance, Mitsuki muttered to herself as she remembered Nizu's parting words. Little as it is, the principal had told her that he'd wait for the resolution of her son's trial, if there was one, before making his final decision. It was possible for Katsuki to walk away from this without jail time, heavily restricted, sure, but still free. That was, if the Azui and Ida families felt merciful. Local drive-in Tori, lunchtime. The cheap fast food place the group of 3+ zombie found themselves at hadn't been Baru's first choice in her effort to repay the Midoriya family, but the verdant mother and son pair had insisted on a place that was inexpensive and plentiful. The small but lively establishment the frog woman had eventually chosen was the closest business that fit such a description for their celebration. And did they have something to celebrate about? The regeneration had been a complete success and the test separation had worked out just fine. Tsuyu was now completely free to move around on her own and return to her normal life. For his part, Izuku had been unable to hide his extreme happiness since the all-clear had been given. It was time to eat to their heart's content. "Oh." Tay's happy groan was only slightly muffled by drool as the zombie girl reached for a large piece of raw chicken, intentions to stuff her mouth full with the meat clear to all. Acting almost as if it were second nature, Izuku lightly slapped the undead's hand away. "No, you wait until it's well cooked, then you eat," the green-haired teen said, effortlessly popping an already prepared chunk of meat into Tay's open mouth. The resulting scene of the zombie girl happily chewing away was rather cute, all things considered. Baru found herself more and more fascinated by the boy every moment she spent in his presence. From the hidden potentials of his quirk to his truly noble disposition, he was a wonder. The frog woman knew he was technically a mutant type, and one with abilities that came with concerning side effects to be sure, but Izuku had so far shown such a strong heart that it was impossible not to see the budding hero within him. The Azui matriarch was fully aware of the harsh realities of the world, though, and how people were quick to label others based on the power or appearance of their quirks and leave it at that. Mutants, for one reason or another depending on whom you asked, were always ranked lowest in the hierarchy. Lower still if the individuality in question was classified as dark in nature, which was completely arbitrary trash in her opinion. Even so, there was no doubt in the frogwoman's mind that the green-haired teen sitting across from her must have endured a certain kind of hell for much of his life. Being not only a mutant, but a mutant regenerator at that, already placed him amongst the weakest of classifications, but the additional capability to raise and control the dead dragged him into the dark side of the spectrum as well. The stigma against every step he'd ever taken must have been outrageous. And she would know. Baru prided herself in the fact that a large portion of her law firm's casework was in the pursuit of justice for those unfairly affected by society's bias against those born with weaker quirks. It disgusted her that there was a tendency, or even willingness, to overlook the faults of the strong and flashy just because of what they could do, or the fame they might garner. What worried the Azui matriarch the most, however, was how Izuku Midoriya's situation would be changing soon. With the miraculous success that was her daughter's recovery, those who became interested in the cute cinnamon roll and his quirk would easily overlook his original placement in order to sink their claws into him. These days, everyone wanted a healing quirk in the family, no matter what, which led her thoughts to the worst cases Baru had ever had to handle over the years, those regarding the as-of-yet unbanned practice of quirk breeding. The number of times a family or individual had pushed their quirkist ideals beyond acceptability had become disconcerting lately. And if those same parties knew of a quirk that could not only heal the user, but others as well. So she needs to eat? Karo, Baru eventually asked, shaking herself from her dismal thoughts as she eyed the zombie girl. Unconcerned with the light scrutiny, Tay blissfully chewed away on her piece of chicken. She appeared to the unknowledgeable observer to be completely unconcerned about, even unaware of, the world around her. Not really, Izuku replied, continuing to cook pieces of chicken at their table. But letting her chew on things seems to help quell her need to bite. Also, it seems kind of cruel to eat in front of her without letting her have some. The green-haired teen's considerate words came on the heels of his ongoing effort to keep Tu's plate well supplied. In focusing on such a task, however, the hero in training had been completely missing the grin adorning the face of the watching mother over the meal. So, it's more like she wants to eat, but doesn't have to? Tu asked, mostly as a cover, so she could have more time to wonder why she was enjoying the attention of her savior so much. Unlike the apparently oblivious green-haired teen, the frog girl had noticed the smiles their mothers kept sharing during the trek to the establishment. Her observational talent had been turned against her, however, as now she feared for an incredibly awkward moment that had to be brewing for the future. That's what I figure, Izuku answered after swallowing his own bite of food. It's a human instinct after all. Yesterday, you weren't able to stomach food, but that didn't stop you from wanting to eat something. By that logic, Tay probably has a desire to eat something every now and then. Siu blushed at the reminder of an embarrassing moment from early on in the hospital bed, when she'd unthinkingly asked for a snack only to be immediately reminded by Recovery Girl that her stomach still had a gaping hole in it. Sorry for making you all wait, Inko called out as she took her place at the group's table, returning the party to 4+ zombie. The staff was insistent that I sign a responsibility waiver to keep Tay inside. I don't understand why they're all so on edge around her, though. She's never attacked anyone unprovoked before. Baru waved off her fellow mother's apology, instead silently gesturing with her eyes for Inko to take a look at their children. Both teens had somehow become trapped in a constant state of catching the other's eye, blushing, and then looking away, only to repeat the process. It was adorable. Don't worry about it, Inko-chan. Karo, Baru welcomed the homely mother once she'd taken her fill of the scene. I should be the one apologizing. My husband very much wanted to personally thank your son as well, but couldn't get away today. The firm just had a large influx of new cases come in at the same time a number of our current ones were concluded, so as the chief legal accountant, he's tied up getting everything sorted out. The Azui matriarch felt even more at ease with the Midoriya woman at that moment than she had the day before, both having kept in touch during their children's recoveries. As mothers, their worrying had kept them from sleeping, and having someone who knew exactly how they felt was a great relief. They chatted a little about everything, even getting into some incredibly personal matters. It had come as a surprise to Baru to discover that her new friend had become a widow only 5 years ago, though her husband had been away from the family's home due to work for much longer. Official documents showed that Hisashi Midoriya's death had been caused by a work-related accident, completely at the employer's fault. A generous life insurance policy, coupled with compensation provided by the company, had been enough for Inko to sustain a comfortable life as a lower-middle-class single mother. The real story, however, had turned out to be much more scandalous. Inko had been hesitant to share at first, but half a decade of bottled-up words and emotions had eventually come pouring out in the face of Baru's calm and understanding mannerisms. The homely woman had spoken of an affair with a younger woman, a murder, fake divorce and marriage certificates, and even an attempt to abscond with both the insurance money and compensation. It had been a wild tale to be sure, and one that Izuku was better off not knowing. The poor child's life was already hard enough without the extra burden of the truth of his father's fate weighing on his shoulders. I think it's kind of better this way, and no offense. Izuku shouted, hands waving crazily as soon as he realized how his words could be taken. I mean, I want to meet your husband too, ma'am, but I don't know what I could say to him. You've already forgiven me for when I had to touch Tsuchan, but would he feel the same? As the green-haired teen voiced his thoughts and fears, the kindness and understanding in the Azui matriarch's round eyes were a reassuring sight to see. Still, even though Tsuyu's mother seemed to be just like his own in being empathetic and accepting, he never really had a father figure present enough to be able to guess how one would react. The hero in training truly believed he had no guarantee of survival if he encountered the man. He would have loved to meet you, Karo, Tsuyu replied with honesty. There was little doubt in her mind of this fact, even though she'd only had less than a day to really tell her parents about her classmate and savior. The frog girl knew very well her mother and father dreamed of finding her a suitor like Izuku, one that was not only noble, but responsible, easygoing, hardworking, and depended more on his brains than brawn. Quietly, she also knew they'd often despaired at the prospect of ever finding such a person. But now, indeed he would have, Karo, Baru agreed. Suddenly, the frog woman turned to Inko, a serious look stealing over her normally stoic face. That reminds me, Inko-chan. I would like to make you a proposition. Tsuyu froze on the spot. She'd known her mother would bring up the idea at some point, but to cut straight to talk of an arranged marriage after only a day? The frog girl had known one would most likely be in her future if she wanted a family anyway, but she really didn't want to force her new best friend and savior into a situation like this so soon. Especially not right now. Tsuchan, are you alright? Izuku asked when he noticed how Tsuyu had stiffened and paled out of the blue. In response, the frog girl only blushed, unable to help herself in the face of such caring shown by her savior. He spoke, and it was like honey flowed from his lips. You see, I have 2 other children, a real pair of little devils, Baru began, laying out the groundwork for her plan. The frog woman knew the first step had succeeded when she saw her daughter visibly relax at her words. She hoped there'd be no open objection from Tsuyu if the tadpole didn't recognize the web her mother was weaving. Usually my eldest here is more than happy to help take care of them, but this incident has opened my eyes. I've been taking her for granted. It's high time my husband and I looked into hiring a babysitter so Tsu-chan can focus on her studies, and we can return to our work free of worry. Oh my, Inko exclaimed, catching on to what her fellow mother was getting at. That sounds like a wonderful idea. Izuku, you don't mind, do you? The homely mother was absolutely beaming. She'd been aching to care for a little one again, and now here was an opportunity that came with 2. It was a wish come true. And earning a little extra to maybe get her precious boy something a little nicer for Christmas this year didn't sound too bad either. Of course I don't, Izuku assured, unable to say no to his mother's smile. Just don't do more than you can. Tsuyu had relaxed a little at this point, but not completely. There had to be more to her mother's offer than she was seeing. The woman wasn't one to be unduly kind to strangers. And as the one who she and her siblings had inherited their blunt honesty and intellect from, the frog girl knew she was right to be suspicious. Great, we can talk details later, Karo, Baru said, now turning to Izuku. Also, this will make the next petition easier. Izuku, the green-haired teen, wasn't the only one who snapped to attention when he was called. Sue and Tay both stiffened in response to the frogwoman's sudden focus on the hero in training. Yes, ma'am, Izuku answered, ready to listen. In his heart, he hoped he wasn't about to be asked to distance himself from Sue. He treasured the new friendship he'd made dearly. I know this may be overstepping or asking too much, but the words sent Izuku's stomach sinking to his feet. He didn't like how this was sounding. Could you accompany my daughter to school from now on? I would feel much better if I knew you were by her side for a little while longer, Karo. The Azui matriarch's request was met with speechless shock by all present, none more so than the daughter in question. You couldn't believe how obvious her mother was being with her plan. The frog girl's shock quickly morphed to fear when she saw her savior shake himself and prepare an answer. She didn't know which would be worse, acceptance or denial. Either option terrified her. Of course, I would be honored. Such a firm and honest answer had to, turning red all over again, unable to cope with the new reality of her life. Her savior would continue to gallantly protect her even though her time of need had ended. Why you will? Karo, the frog girl asked out of reflex before she could stop herself. Instantly she wished she could have bitten her tongue. The enthusiastic nod she received in response only deepened Sue's blush. Her savior was almost too earnest in his naivety sometimes. Yes, as a matter of fact, I was going to ask to be allowed to do something like that anyway. Izuku hardly took a breath before continuing. Maybe to and from school, actually. I mean, there's so much we don't know about my quirk still. There's still a chance you may feel, UMFH. The makings of a patented Izuku Midoriya mumbling episode was cut off before it could gather steam as Tsu decided to stop any further embarrassment and lose of her mood by forcing a piece of chicken into his mouth. We should eat before the food gets cold, Karo, the frog girl said in defense of her action. So focused was she on getting her mind off of what had just happened that she failed to notice that she began to use the same chopsticks she'd used to feed Izuku. Eyes locked on her food. She also missed the matching grins the two mothers wore as they silently cheered at the indirect kiss. Conversation drifted to more mundane topics from there. Both Inko and Baru smiled warmly as they chatted and watched their children. Both knew an inevitability when they saw one, but were more than willing to give a little push to get the ball rolling a bit faster. Izuku and Tsuyu's conversation turned to what to expect Monday, both doubting Mina would remain quiet about what she'd seen. The green duo was confident that at least Tokoimi would take their side, however, for Izuku's sake at least. That night, Azui family residence. After tossing and turning for who knew how long, Hugh gave up and admitted she couldn't get to sleep. No matter how much she tried, her mind wouldn't shut off and allow her to slumber. And she knew why. Thoughts of a certain green-haired teen that had freely given his own blood to save her life were completely filling her head. The frog girl felt silly. It was childish of her to be making such a big deal out of it. She was attending a school for heroes. She needed to act like a student of such was expected to, regardless of her feelings. But what if he likes me like that? Karo, Tsu whispered, to herself or the darkroom. She didn't know. Being so openly accepted despite her amphibian features was a novelty the frog girl just couldn't shake. It had been an unexpectedly warm comfort in an unfamiliar setting. Unlike her bed, which even in the familiarity of her bedroom still felt annoyingly cold and smelled quite plain for some reason. It was so unlike what she'd experienced the night prior. Karo, Tsu bolted upright, startled. Her veins had just tickled her. In the back of her mind, a worming fear began to grow as she suddenly felt as if she could sense something familiar in the distance. It was too far away to reach, or even make an attempt to, but before she could even think more on it, a memory of the previous night surfaced in her stricken mind. As she'd lain on top of her savior, he'd told her that his blood sometimes felt like it tickled his veins, as if answering him when he spoke. "Is that you, Izukuin?" Tsu asked, looking down at herself, her veins. "Will you keep me warm at night again?" Karo, the frog girl had to wonder. How much of this was the boy caring for her so much that not even distance could keep him from comforting her? And how much was her own yearning? Another sudden ticklish sensation assaulted her, causing her to feel a warmth spread through her. It wasn't as much as the real deal she'd experienced skin to skin against Izuku, but it was enough she understood she shouldn't be feeling the temperature change so much. She was supposed to be cold-blooded. Karo. Tsu fell onto her pillow again, the giddy happiness she felt unable to be contained. Now she wanted Monday to arrive faster than ever so she could see her savior again. Same time, Midoriya residence. In his own bed, Izuku was hugging a spare pillow while warmly remembering the previous night. The memory of spending a whole night hugging a cute girl kept him so warm he could almost bask in it. He'd gladly take an opportunity to do such a thing again, although hopefully under less dire circumstances. The green-haired teen didn't think too hard on the fact he continuously failed to imagine a different girl in his arms other than two, whenever he tried to fantasize about another such night. It was too early in their friendship, heck their lives, to chase such goals. It could be disastrous if he tried to jump into such a thing without thought. The frog girl didn't even know about all of his faults, like the peculiar decorations adorning his room. I wonder if Tsu-chan would find this healthy? Izuku murmured to himself as he glanced around his room swathed in the shadows of night. Long gone were the days that even in darkness one could see the walls were covered in brightly colored posters of All Might and other top heroes, the shelves crammed with hero figurines, and the bookshelves packed with comics. Nowadays, Izuku's room appeared more akin to one of a medical student in their residency. Medical posters covering all levels of anatomic detail were plastered on the walls. The bookshelf was stuffed with medical tomes, and the shelves, those were populated by plush dolls of all shapes and sizes. What? He couldn't live without cuteness. Even Tae, as she laid on the floor, enjoyed the company of a large rabbit doll. The zombie girl seemed to take a special pleasure in nibbling on the poor thing's ears. Monday, outside the Azui residence, early in the morning, Izuku was overflowing with nerves. This was the first time he'd ever stood outside of a home specifically because he was waiting for a girl. Never mind it was to walk her to school. It made the green-haired teen feel like he was waiting for his girlfriend or something similar. The invasive romantic thought forced another blush across his face. The prospect of that kind of relationship made him happy, but filled him with fear as well. He couldn't entertain the idea of being with someone, especially Tsuyu, until they'd seen the worst of what he truly was. Steeling himself, he readied himself to call at the door. On second thought, maybe I should give her another 3 minutes? It's still early for. Izuku trailed off, realizing he'd have to come face to face with Tsuyu's father soon, a thought that did nothing for his anxiety. Sure, he'd saved the man's daughter, but surely he'd still be cross with him for spending an entire night wrapped around the frog girl? Nothing had happened, of course, but still. Ah! Tae groaned, plunking her hand right on the button-like doorbell. A faint ding-dong could be heard inside the residence, letting Izuku know those inside now knew someone was at their door. You did that on purpose, didn't you? Izuku accused the zombie girl with more than a little disdain in his voice. Although he really couldn't blame Tae for her actions, if he'd been by himself it might have been hours before he'd gathered enough courage to do such a mundane thing. And that wouldn't fly since he'd already agreed he'd do this. And they had to get to class on time. The second the door to the home opened, a green missile shot out and tackled Izuku to the ground, leaving a confused Tae to blink at the now empty spot her master had occupied less than a second ago. Looking down at his chest, the green-haired teen discovered that the missile was actually none other than Tsu, who'd occupied herself with happily nuzzling him. Izuku hugged the frog girl without thinking, her absolute cuteness pulling a smile from him with ease. Then he looked up and realized a largish man had also walked onto the scene. I'm in trouble, aren't I? Izuku asked, who could only be Tsuyu's father. He hoped this wouldn't turn out too badly. The rather amphibious-looking man scratched the back of his head while taking in the scene before him. Then he sighed. No, son, you're not, Tsuyu's father replied, looking both amused and resigned at the sight of the two teens. But you will be if you let her dictate your entire life, Karo. Before Izuku could ask what the man meant by that, Baru quickly stepped into the doorway. Did you say something, Gamma dear? Karo, the frog woman asked as she hugged her husband's arm. Just remembering how much I love you. Gamma answered quickly before picking up a briefcase that had been sitting inside behind him. I've got to run to the firm now. Enjoy your day, love, Karo. The amphibious man kissed his wife, gave one last smile in Izuku and Tsuyu's direction, and then hurried away. And if he'd had to force himself to ignore the sight of his daughter swooning over a boy a little more than it appeared he did, well, no one asked. Meanwhile, at the Bakugo residence, Mitsuki's weekend had been horrible. Sleep had eluded her, But the worst thing was that her husband had completely stopped talking to her. Her nightmare was worsening every minute. The stable family she'd worked so hard for was crumbling away. If things didn't change soon, there wouldn't be a family at all. At least the Ashen mother had managed to arrange a meeting with the lawyers of the Azui and Ida families for the end of the week. It was her only chance at settling things outside of court, an infinitesimal chance to salvage the situation and maybe keep her family together. 1 week, we just need to survive for 1 week. After that, Mitsuki's words drifted into incoherency as she drank another shot of sake. She'd long since found it impossible to deal with her current reality while completely sober. Asking Inko, her longtime friend, for forgiveness, for which the homely woman had always been so free to give in the past, had been a hard-hitting bust. The green-haired mother had flat-out refused to take her calls, and the absence of any response to the numerous messages she'd left clued the Ashen woman in that this hadn't been a snap, emotional decision. The Midoriya matriarch didn't want to talk to her at all. Any hope of Inko appealing to the Azui and Ida families as a proxy for the Bakugos had since died. It was a bad omen for things to come if Kochan had finally had enough and turned away from Mitsuki. The Ashen mother felt a part of her heart quiver at the depressing thought. Is there anything in this pit to make breakfast with? Katsuki rudely asked as he jerked open the fridge. Finding only eggs, the blonde bit back a curse at the lack of options. He'd never admit it, but Katsuki had been much like his mother the previous nights. There'd been no sleep, no peace for him as he'd lain there, dying on the inside. Every time he'd closed his eyes, the blonde had only been able to see the inevitable events to come, where he'd be forced to discard his pride and dignity and beg like a dog for forgiveness. None of this nightmare would be happening if the freak had just engaged him in a straight fight. Everything being at stake like this was fucking Romero's fault. Katsuki still knew that to be true, but he'd already decided he'd play along and be a good boy. Nothing would ever make him give up his dream, even going through this humiliation. And one day he'd still be the undefeatable #1 hero. So the blonde swore to himself that someday he'd prove to everyone that he'd been right, and that the green fucking abomination had been in the wrong. UA campus, before first bell. Izuku and Tsuyu had made it safely to UA's grounds, both blushing the entire walk. An awkward silence had hung over the duo the entire trek. One believing his mouth would betray him with strings of embarrassing words, the other fearing her body would betray her and cause her to reach out to lean against her savior. Both teens were either unaware or unable to recognize that their hands had been intertwined the entire time. Tay's soft, questioning groan forced the green duo to stop and turn to face her. We're not blushing. The denial was shouted in stereo, earning laughter from the random and ignorant second and third years that were passing by. Wondering at what was so funny, Izuku and Tsu noticed too late that yes, they were indeed blushing. The additional awkwardness that followed the discovery lasted until it inexplicably turned into laughter. I'm sorry about that, Izuku apologized, scratching the back of his head bashfully. It's just, I've been worried about you, you know? Wondering if you've been feeling okay. I don't want bad things happening to you. Tsuyu's already reddened cheeks deepened to a lovely rouge hue at the words of her savior. A small smile tugged at her lips, and the frog girl looked down to avoid eye contact. It's okay, Izuku, Hugh said, flicking her eyes back and forth from her feet to the bright emeralds that were staring at her. I had to do my best not to call you. I thought you'd be worrying too much, but also, I missed you. The confession, spoken so softly, was almost missed by the green-haired teen. But as luck would have it, Izuku managed to hear the heartfelt words and blushed all the more for them. Tsu-chan, Izuku said, wondering how he could phrase how he felt in that moment. He decided to let his rambling speak for him for once. You can call me whenever, for whatever. If you need me, I'll be by your side. I'll find a way to reach you, no matter what. I'm sounding weird again. Maybe letting his mouth go without his brain hadn't been such a good idea. The green-haired teen eventually conceded that his words were probably better suited for a boyfriend, but they had accurately described how he felt. Tsuyu merely giggled at her bumbling savior. For some reason, she felt like teasing him in the near future would be a delightful pastime of hers. UA campus, classroom 1. Do you think Mina-chan said something to the rest of the class? Tiu asked as the two teens reached the door to their classroom. You know about what happened in Recovery Girl's office. Izuku suppressed a shudder at the thought of what their pink-hued classmate could have said and done already. The acid user had never been malicious in her gossiping as far as the green-haired teen knew, but she often didn't think before she spoke, and topics that were supposed to be secrets were a major weakness of hers. I certainly hope not. Izuku replied uneasily as he opened the door for two. The frog girl entered, stoic face appearing to be prepared for the worst. Following behind his friend, the green-haired teen let Tay close the door behind him. Silence. Complete and total, abysmal silence was all that greeted the green duo as soon as they walked into 1A's homeroom. That, and a lot of penetrating stares. The entirety of 1A that remained stared intently at the two teens, or more precisely, their intertwined hands. Some of these gazes were cold, more akin to glares, while others were envious. Quite a few were dripping with curiosity as well, and as should have been expected, Mina's in particular was chock full of mischief. It didn't take long for one Minoru Mineta to angrily hop out of his chair and stomp his way towards the green duo. Before he'd even fully reached his destination, the diminutive boy had taken out and shoved his phone in Izuku's face. How? How could you do this? How dare you even show your face around here after this? Mineta worked his way up to screaming, his voice pitched in despair. Not only did you already have a sexy slave girl when we first met you, but now you have to go and flaunt this in front of us too. The picture backlit on the phone was of Izuku and Tsu in a rather daring position, their faces close enough to be preparing for a passionate kiss. That the angle of the photo made it obvious to see that the frog girl's hospital gown had been completely open at the back at the time did nothing to dispel the apparent nature of the compromising position. Tsu-chan, is it true? Ochiko asked, hesitantly approaching the frog girl. Did you really have to do stuff to get healed? For her part, you couldn't immediately process what her normally bubbly friend meant by those words, but in the end it didn't matter. That one simple question had unleashed the floodgates. In the blink of an eye, the green duo was swarmed and separated by their classmates. The two mobs were a cacophony of noise, multiple voices shouting and yelling over each other, asking one awkward question after another about the picture and what had transpired in the nurse's office behind closed doors. Both Izuku and Tsu immediately wished they'd thought to report themselves sick that morning, anything to avoid the trouble they were now facing. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. Support the writer. Don't forget to like, sub, and share.